Begin on page 20. The May revise proposing to eliminate the CalWORKs program for savings of $1.6 billion. Plus, we have the most recent proposal to eliminate all COLAs going forward. LAO, you have some alternatives here. I think we need to, we're all very mindful of the impacts of eliminating such a program, and I think what we need to do is explore some alternatives for, we realize we have to find some significant savings in the program, but outright elimination, personally, I'm not in favor of. I also want to note for members of the public and the members that page 21 also includes a CalWORKs reduction proposal, which was, I believe, in the original May revise. So we can address both of them at the same time.
Okay. Good afternoon. Todd Bland with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Essentially, the governor is proposing, sequentially propose some changes to CalWORKs and then outright elimination. On the elimination issue, we would not support that. We believe it results in a substantial cost shift to counties and a substantial loss of federal funds. As an alternative, at quite a bit less savings, we suggest you consider building on an aspect of current law. And that aspect of current law is that if the state does not have enough money to fund welfare to work services and child care to help the CalWORKs families become self-sufficient, that is a reason for good cause, a reason for non-participation in the program. That's current law. So essentially, building on that, we believe you could reduce the budget for employment services by about $108 million and reduce the budget for child care by about $105 million. Those are roughly 10 and 15% of their current amounts. And that, on the child care, that was just the stage 1 child care. You could make those reductions, and then you could create targeted exemptions for more cases. The County Welfare Directors Association has been looking at this as well, and they've come up with the concept of one of the target exemptions they were looking at was high-cost child care cases, such as cases with a lot of either very young children or a lot of children under the age of non-school age children. To that, you could add other potential targeted exemptions, and these would be, we were thinking in the area of cases with multiple barriers to employment, learning disabilities, perhaps English language issues. You could be very specific in these in statute, or you could be more permissive in terms of giving the counties the authority to sort of make these exemptions. The goal would be the people who are exempted would be it would be voluntary. If they chose to participate, they could. But we have reduced the budget, so in theory, if they chose to participate and there wasn't sufficient funding, the savings would be real because you're going to reduce the appropriations for both of these amounts. It would create waiting lists essentially for those services. So essentially, that's the LAO approach in a nutshell. The $201 million that we put on our sheet is actually slightly net of a little bit of grant costs because we would have less people participating. That would actually raise our grant costs a little bit, but we do receive the 80% federal participation on that, so it doesn't cost very much. So the action would be a couple of cuts and then a teeny bit of grant costs coming in. That's our main recommendation in lieu of the elimination of CalWORKs. We do have, sort of turning to the next page, the governor's several proposals, grant reduction and the child-only time limit and such. There, again, we're not really in favor of these either, given the federal American Recovery and Reinvestment Act essentially is giving us an 80% funding source for grant costs above our 2007 levels. Given that, we would suggest not making reforms until that funding stream ends. Although we think you might want to take action now because the kind of reforms you might want to do take time and giving the counties time to plan. Our alternatives are much smaller than the governor's. We're thinking about adopting a community service requirement for the families in the safety net, basically making them an offer of a community service requirement only if they turned it down and a home visit then didn't reveal that they had otherwise good cause. we would then terminate aid rather than outright termination. We also think that the self-sufficiency reviews that the governor proposes, the in-person interview, we don't like the governor's approach to that, but we think a modified approach could work. Our approach would focus on the cases with adults. The governor's approach was very broad. It was virtually every case, even the child-only cases where there is no adult that we need to engage. So on a narrower basis, our approach was just do this to the cases with adults, try to engage them, spend a half hour with them, much smaller savings on the order of about $16 million. And finally, a past proposal we put out to further increase the incentive to work would be to modify the earned income disregard. We could have a long discussion. I'll keep it real brief. Under current law, essentially, as you earn money, the first $225 money you earn, your grant doesn't go down at all. After that, after the $225, it goes down 50 cents. So we call it the 225 and 50% disregard. What we're proposing is you slightly flip that on its head. Instead, we make it 50% and 300. And the concept is, if you aren't meeting federal work participation requirements, you only get the 50% reduction. You sort of get the $300 bonus comes if you're meeting. It was to move the incentive up the line. It has the effect of moving some people's grants up, some people's down, although if they choose to work more, no one's goes down. It was discussed a year ago. Those are our kind of smaller proposals in lieu of what the governor has on page 21. Happy to take questions.
Can you tell me what the total savings is from all of your proposals combined if we were to take them all?
Well, actually, the main proposal is the non-elimination targeted exemptions. The net savings from that is $201 million.
That I got, and then you got a $16 million figure.
The others would add up to about 45, but we're actually recommending them for 10-11. You take action now to plan for them, but we would not recommend them at this time because you have the 80% funding stream.
I see. Okay. Mr. Cheney?
To quote two questions. This one is always frustrating. Short of elimination, I'm not quite sure we structure the program to make it more effective. We can do it. If it's savings is kind of an anomalous term in this context. The MOE is the MOE is the MOE. Savings have to be used for TANF MOE.
We're above the if you do nothing to the program, you're $400 to $500 million above the MOE.
Oh,
so
well,
you can actually take
that.
these reductions. So yeah, the issue here is not the main issue.
How did we get above the MOE? We haven't been above the MOE in 10 years.
Because our caseload is rising very, very fast. 10% the current year. The projection is 15% of the budget. It's another issue.
But the federal match.
Federal block grant doesn't.
No, the federal overmatch, the stimulus.
It helps. We'd be even more over without it.
Doesn't that match? I see. So we're actually over the MOE.
We are.
Okay.
And we're over the MOE this year as well. And
It's because of the new caseload.
And in some prior years, we've been over depending on how it is that one chose to count MOE expenditures, we could have been over the MOE.
Well, that's fair.
If we had counted everything that was counted.
I think the chart we don't have today that we've had sometimes in the past is what all we're counting as MOE. Now, it gets awkward with your budget where you're eliminating, but assume your first may revise. We ought to think about, are we still counting, for instance, are we counting the probation camps that are now funded by the .15 VLF? Are those in the MOE anymore? Because they used to be. The probation camps aren't in the MOE.
At one time, we spent federal funds on them.
Right.
Then we moved them back to general fund, and when they're general fund, we cannot count them. Right. Your option would be to go the other direction.
I'm just trying to figure out what we're counting anymore, because we used to count a lot of our child care. We count the CalWORKs and community colleges. We count. Right. I'm trying. Where else? Traditionally, we have saved about $1 billion in other universes by counting them as MOE. And even the governor's elimination proposal, by their numbers, only saves $1 billion. That is only half of the value of the MOE. So I'm trying to figure out.
It's $1.7 billion altogether.
Yeah, well, and the MOE is 2.7. If you're saying we're over, that means you're spending 3. And they're only going to save $1 billion by eliminating the program. So that means I got $2 billion stashed in other places in the budget that nobody's talking about.
Sorry, Nick Buchan, Department of Finance. The $1.7 billion is also assumes October 1st implementation. Right. So the full year value is above $2 billion if we eliminate the program.
Right. And the counties in part help us meet the maintenance of effort, and
I mean, the maintenance of effort has always been lots of places,
Because
not
you're
just
above
general
the
fund.
maintenance of effort, you really have
It's
a lot more
different now.
flexibility. In the past, yes, it was sort of like, oh, we're on the floor. We could make a program savings,
Right.
which would lead to TANF savings, but because of the MOE, it was like, okay, how are we going to convert that into general fund savings?
Okay, but now that's changed.
You don't have that issue for the first $400, $500,
Because
$600
of the
million
caseload.
of your cuts this year.
Because of the caseload.
Right.
Okay, no, that's fair. It's
And
helpful to
just to
understand.
clarify that, if we weren't going to do any reductions in CalWORKs and we didn't get the ARA funding, we would have over $1 billion of general fund in social services budget just to fund the core CalWORKs program.
Right. Now, with the ARA funding, it's my understanding that that can be used, and I don't know how much of it is which and how, whatever, to do a subsidized employment program. Has anybody looked at how we might offer funds from TANF to help folks get jobs and help hire people without as much cost?
I believe the counties and the department, and maybe Mr. Garcia can elaborate some more, are working on a proposal whereby I believe the counties would be able to come up with an in-kind match, if I got that right, that where essentially there is no state cost, and we could draw down the 80% money to the extent counties wanted to create subsidized employment. That's the level I know it at.
Is there something we would have to do in trailer to make that more possible, or incentivize it, or make it a good thing to do?
There might be, and in fact, there is some trailer bill language proposed to go with that idea.
I mean, I guess when I'm trying to make the program function, I can pretty much say, I mean, I understand that may not be the view of every member of the conference committee, but most of us are not prepared to eliminate this program. So what we can do to constrain it, what we can do to save if we are in fact spending over the MOE are legitimate discussions to me. I do think we ought to encourage the subsidized employment, because as long as we have the extra match, we ought to be trying to help the economy and helping people get work, and helping people who might not otherwise be able to hire an employee and kind of move things along is a good thing.
If there's no state cost there, that would appear to be win-win.
So
It would
that's
help on work
that's a huge
participation,
deal
income for
me.
recipients.
Now, remind me why we didn't do the income disregard thing last year, because I remember we had a lot of controversy back and forth about whether that was a good way to do it. I kind of like it, but I'm not quite sure why we rejected it.
Some recipients would would have lower grants if they didn't. It's an incentive. The idea is will you increase your work effort to move up the slope of the line where you get the slightly more generous payment.
Madam Chair,
not everyone would necessarily.
On that point,
Yeah.
you had said earlier that gives incentive, and those folks who would be on the losing end have the opportunity to just get back to work, except in this economy, that's not always a choice.
Again,
but work
that was also a budget
activities
plus
here.
one proposal for us, but I take your point about what will the health of the economy be in terms of being able to employ welfare recipients even in 10-11.
Well, but to meet the workforce requirements, they can be doing whatever them and their social worker agree on, and it's a wide range of activities. They could be going to school. They could be.
But
they
the
can do
disregard
community
was about
service.
earned income.
Is earned income only.
That's about
I
earned
see.
income, not
So
just
it may
about
not.
participation.
So that might be a problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
'Cause
probably the debate.
The other question, I mean, I do remember when we first did this program, there was a lot of debate about whether that 1-year-old age was the right age, or whether it should be 18 months, or whether it should be 2 years to begin with, because the cost of the child care for that parent, and this is just one we all need to think about if we're thinking about these. That one, it's on one hand, it feels like, well, why are we letting these people not work? But on the other hand, I do remember the discussion at the time of the CalWORKs was originally done, which was, should it be 18 months? Should folks stay home? Is the child care at that age so expensive?
Right.
But if they were to do that, then are those folks, do those 2 years count against your 60 months, even though you're not engaged in work activities?
We would recommend, if you go with targeted exemptions, you're exempting these people, not requiring them to participate, that you would probably not
the
count
time
their
that we told
state
it.
clock during that time for which
That's
they were
what I'm
exempted. If they
wanting to
chose
get
to
there.
participate and they took advantage of the services, you would count. Their federal clock has to count. There's no way around that.
The 60-month clock.
The federal
But the
one.
20
The state one.
The
one.
state 2-year thing.
We don't have a 2-year anymore. We got rid of that a few years
did
ago.
we? Okay, sorry.
It's
So
a
what's the
state
state
clock
clock?
But there's a state 60-month for the adult, and then we move you to the safety net after that. So probably
I see.
You could argue it either way, but I would tend to think on the policy merits you would tend to want to say if you're going to exempt the people from participation and not provide the services, we shouldn't count their
Yeah, that's
60-month
kind of
clock
the
against
problem.
that adult for that time period. Again, we see this
Yeah,
as a
just for
time-limited thing that you would be doing
just for a year, you'd
15
or
months through
something
the
like
end of
that,
the
offer
ARA
the-
period. It isn't without regret. I mean, we're to some extent basically telling families who we would like to take advantage of our services and our child care and our interventions to be able to become self-sufficient sooner. We're delaying that. I mean, but again, we're in a difficult budget environment, we're making difficult choices. The advantage of this is you're able to achieve substantial savings, $200 million. Until the governor proposed eliminating the program, it was more savings than they had.
Let me just mention, I think staff and the LAO and the Department of Finance and the department are all working on well, I don't know, does it include the Department of Finance? Are we all working on this package? Anyway, there's a package being worked up of alternatives other than eliminating the program. And a lot of the things that were just discussed, I think, are being looked at as part of that package that would come back to us, because we're going to have to hold this open. Mr. Leno, then Mr. Blumenfield, then Mr. De Leon. Okay, then Mr. Blumenfield.
Okay, well, good. I think you've just by clearing it up that there's just no way we can eliminate CalWORKs. I'm curious though, are there any other states in the country that have completely abdicated their responsibility for the social safety net, or proposed such a thing?
No other states have done such a thing.
So we would be just clarified. If we actually took this proposal, we would be the only state in the nation to abdicate this responsibility. Would we be the only?
It would shift to our counties.
It would
largely shift to our counties, but as a state, there would be no state program.
We're the
yes.
only state who would abdicate the responsibility. Obviously, if we had responsible counties, which most of them are, they would pick up this burden, and it would be an additional cost to them. But I'm also curious: are there any countries in the industrialized world that have don't have a social safety net and have abdicated that responsibility? I mean, I don't know of any. That's why I'm asking the question. It's more of a rhetorical question, but I think it's irresponsible to even have this elimination out on the table. I mean, we're talking about a responsible compromise and trying to figure something out, and that's good. And maybe it was just put out there to provoke and spark a dialogue, but I mean, it's outrageous to even propose.
Mr. De Leon.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Given the number of people right now who are being affected by this really bad economy, and a lot of folks who are being driven into poverty and perhaps homelessness, and especially with the federal government's willingness to pay for CalWORKs program growth, does it make sense to actually eliminate this program in its entirety, or can we better target the cuts when it comes to CalWORKs? And I'm referencing to the Fed's willingness to fund CalWORKs growth.
For those reasons and the county cost shift, we are recommending against elimination in favor of our alternative.
And we believe the general fund condition is such that we recognize that we'd be leaving a lot of federal funds on the table, and we recognize the hardship that this proposal would result in. That said, we believe that based on our general fund condition, based on where it is that we have flexibility to make reductions, where it is that we have federal mandates versus federal opt-ins, that this is a reduction that's necessary, and that program elimination is what is needed to balance the budget.
You may have answered the question already. Perhaps Senator Duchesne may have answered it earlier. I just got here a little late. What's the dollar figure we leave on the table with this CalWORKs proposed elimination?
Roughly $4.2 billion, and that would be on a full year basis, $3.7 billion federal block grant. And on a more temporary basis, the American Recovery, the ARA contingency, probably about $500 million. That's
so
the numbers we're using.
4.2 billion.
Right.
4.2 billion one-time ARA dollars of 500. Was that?
Well, 3.7 plus 4 plus 500 in the ARA dollars,
okay.
and
basically 3.7, which is ongoing.
Yes.
And one-time dollars about half. $500,000, $1 billion, I should say. So. If you can recall, when we're talking about IHSS and the potential that we leave on the table too, with the enhanced FMAP criteria, how much were we leaving on the table right there, if in fact we move forward with the complete elimination, or at least 90% of that elimination?
I think our rough number was 1.4 million was what we shared with you.
So roughly between
Billion,
CalWorks
sorry.
between CalWorks and IHSS, we're leaving on the table about close to $6 billion.
They're not quite apples to apples. The 1.4, I believe we had properly adjusted for you for the remainder of the year. The 4.2 would be, the 500 would be correct. The 3.7, I guess we'd want 3/4 of that. So maybe $3.5 billion.
You were saying the 1.4 billion was adjusted for?
That was adjusted for the for 9 months
For 9 months.
Yes. Whereas the
Okay.
3.7 is the whole block grant for the entire year. The proposal, I believe, is 9 months of that. So you'd want to take 3/4 of 3.7 plus 500 million. So not quite the 4.2 we were at, but
Help me
3.5
understand
or
the
so.
9 months part.
Because that's when the proposal goes into effect.
Okay,
It's
gotcha.
implementation lag.
Okay, it's implementation. Again, I'll just underscore and echo and ditto my colleague, Mr. Bob Bloomfield. I won't get into the moral issues, obviously. It's the same that I spoke about earlier today with regards to IHSS. But, fiscally, I think our cuts, we know they're going to happen. We don't know how much yet. It's clear it's going to happen. But I think that we could be much smarter, more intelligent in the way we go about doing this. So, again, the underlying principle, if you will, or the overarching goal with the way we go about, cutting this budget deficit is how we are as least injurious to the most vulnerable and how we are fiscally prudent by not leaving all these dollars on the table from the feds that we're not going to have coming into California. Because a lot of these proposals right now are, and I mean no offense to anyone who's from the South who's present here today, but it takes us back to Mississippi. And some of these proposals take us back to the pre-Enlightenment period. Well, if we're going to have a moat around us and our own security forces, it's beyond belief. So, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. DeLeon. Mr. Nielsen?
Well, I'd like to, little brief historical perspective. The predecessor of this CalWorks was the GAIN program, Greater Avenues for Independence. And I remember the birth of that in this room. Art Agnos and John Garamendi and Jim Nielsen presenting a bill with the room packed with people opposing it, fighting it desperately, with all the passion of those last many days that we have sat here and heard people, don't cut my program. They were fighting it. This has worked. And the successor of GAIN, CalWorks, has indeed worked. And I think because it's not about working for your welfare or just getting as much as welfare forever, but that you will become employable. It's about employability and supporting the development of employable skills. So I think it's a very necessary thing to preserve. But where we are at today, we are facing a huge problem. And we would hope that it's a short-run one problem. Maybe 2 years where we can turn the corner if the economy improves, and we won't get anywhere unless the economy improves, no matter what the legislature does. But assuming that it does, as you're crafting this, and I understand there's a group of you working. I don't know that the Republicans have been involved in this, but I would like that we would be, to come up with an idea in the next day or so that would be along the lines of some of the LAO suggestions, that without elimination, but can preserve the program. And in some way, I would ask you to craft that with keeping in mind that maybe the cuts can be a little greater if they are of a more temporary nature, meaning that there's some hope out there that we can restore some of the CalWorks reductions that we have to accrue for the short-run cash flow needs. So could you kind of couch that into some of your deliberations, and some of the LAO observations, I think, have merit. They have been discussed here. Senator Cheney has talked about them. But my argument would be to pare them down as very much as you can for now, but offer some hope within a year or so that we could kick up, and if things improve economically, CalWorks can be restored to a better level. But I don't think we can just hold on to we've got to preserve it and protect it. That cannot happen with this magnitude of money. But I think maybe there's some ways that we could at least preserve the essence of CalWorks and help as many people as we can continue on that employable track. So I'd like to have us work with you on that as well, the Republicans.
Great. Excellent. We like that. Mr. Leno.
Thank you, Madam Chair. certainly share some of the sentiments of my colleagues on the Assembly side. Wanted also just to build upon what are the unintended consequences, the ramifications of the elimination of the program. We have a note in our briefing that $1 million spent on CalWORKs results in $1.34 million in economic output and $25,000 in state sales tax revenue. So if we were to equate that for $5 billion spent on CalWORKs, that would equate to about $125 million in sales tax dollars that we'd be losing. I wondered, do we have a calculation on how much state income tax we would also lose, and how many additional people would be unemployed, all the teachers and the social workers, all the welfare to workforce? What percentage, is it more than 1% or 2% additional unemployment? And you have 0.6? And then, and how, what does that equate to in state income tax laws as well? So we, again, had to see the whole picture of it. With that said, I would like to reject the elimination.
All right, members, we have a motion to reject the proposed elimination of CalWORKs, and I would add that if that motion passes, we would direct our staff to continue working with the counties, departments, Department of Finance, to come back with a proposal to seek substantial savings within the program. But the motion before us is to reject the elimination.
Madam Chair, I just want to state that I can't support that motion. No comment necessarily on that issue itself, but it is a substantial portion of the solutions that we have to come to, and in the absence of something else, it's just impossible to support that.
Okay. So, yes, Mr. Nielsen.
And I would echo that as well. I will simply abstain on this particular vote in the spirit that we're going to continue to work on it to come up to something that would be substantial, at least for the next year. But that we should be working on some alternative.
So, Mr. Nilo, are you an abstention or a no? An abstention. So on our side, it's 3 ayes, 2 abstentions. On the Senate side, it is 3 ayes and 1 no. Correct? Okay. So with that, but you have the direction, and then there's also the most recent proposal, which we don't have before us in writing, from the governor to eliminate all COLAs in this program going forward.
And Madam Chair, we would have significant concerns with this level of restoration to the budget in light of the general fund situation. In terms of the proposal to eliminate the COLA prospectively, similar to our discussion relative to the SSP COLA, as well as COLAs across the budget, we think, given our out-year challenges, that it's more appropriate to have an annual determination. We think that the type of COLAs that drive annual increases are not the way to go, that it's a year-by-year determination based on the level of resources available, and as such, we're proposing elimination of COLAs across items in the budget.
I appreciate the presentation. The problem is we don't have it in writing in our agenda, and it's because it was just so recently submitted that we can't really, I mean, I don't favor the proposal, but I also don't feel comfortable taking some action or recommending to this committee that it take action right now because we don't have it in the agenda. It hasn't been out in the public, noticed on our agenda for discussion. We don't have trailer bill language. We don't have specifics. So what I would ask, if the committee has no objection, is to hold that item open until we do get something written that we can show to the public that here we are, we're going to consider this. That's the problem. It's not on here, and yet it was a recently submitted proposal by the governor to eliminate all CalWORKs COLAs going forward.
I think it's
very
new trailer
significant
bill that's
issue.
just coming out.
And the reason it's not before you as a budgetary action is there's no impact to the 2009-10 budget. This is prospective beginning 10-11. So you will see trailer bill language that would eliminate
Just run a
it.
bill if it's not till 10-11. See if anybody bites. Run it through policy committee.
That might be the better way to go. Okay, so we'll move on then. I believe we also discussed page 21. We can move on to page 22. Department of Social Services Cash Assistance Program for Immigrants and California Food Assistance Program. Looks like from the 2 programs there would be $85.7 million savings from CAPI and $33.8 from CFAP. recommendation is to hold open at this point, but I think we need discussion, and perhaps we can take action today. Mr. Cheney?
I just have a, well, I mean, I'm okay with holding this open, because I think the one thing we need to think about on this one, and I don't know. I mean, it's frustrating. This is one of the, 14th annual rant against the federal government for creating this problem. But, prior to 1996, all legal immigrants were covered the same as citizens under most of these programs. When they changed that with TANF and everything else, and, we did the first state-only programs with Governor Wilson's support, because we knew that as a high immigrant state, we couldn't afford to have that many people being thrown off of fundamental support programs. So I appreciate that subsequent to that, many states did as we did and created state-only programs. The federal government then stepped up a few years later and started covering some of the populations that we covered initially with our state-only programs. Unfortunately, they never just did the simple thing and said, oh, gosh, that was a mistake. We should just allow legal immigrants to get the same benefits just like they always used to do. And so now we remain with these state-only programs that are a little bit odd and anomalies. The CAPI now, it's only people who got here before 96 or something. I mean, we've been allowing new people into CAPI? Oh, because they're newly qualified, but they're not 5 years.
After the 10 we changed it to 10 years of deeming the sponsor's income if there was a sponsor involved. Okay. So if you sort of run the clock from, I get confused about 96 and 98, but essentially you run the clock forward the 10 years. So essentially we are taking new folks into the cash assistance program for immigrants. That's one reason why it's growing, and that's one of our options would be to return to that longer term deeming, or perhaps think about restricting the program to people who are essentially living on their own with CAPI. In other words, often they're part of multi-generational households.
Yeah, that's
so
usually.
In a difficult budget environment, we might say, living with family, your benefits may be terminated, but living on your own will continue them. So that's sort of the LAO approach to this. You could combine that with a more enhanced deeming approach as well.
The deeming was 10 years?
We did 10. We originally did 5.
We originally did 5.
Came up to the 5, and then we added 5 more.
I see. And it was because we haven't, but the problem became, at least as I understand the existing caseload in this, it's mostly these senior citizen widows that, they're 80 years old and they're never going to learn English, so they can't become citizens kind of problem. I don't know how much of it is that, but some of it is, refugee. A lot of it's a refugee population. A lot of it's widows.
The refugees had a 7-year exemption, and then there was some recent law that actually gave the refugees some new benefits. So, yeah, it's refugees who've had that expire.
I think it's a fair,
components.
First of all, saying up front that the federal government should be just doing whatever it is they do, and we should be matching that and just making it work. Re-looking at the criteria for the program, it has been 10 years. The original notion was sort of a temporary idea, and it's kind of lingered. And as much as I don't like treating immigrants differently than citizens, this is a little strange because of the state-only nature of it. Because at this point, the feds have picked up a large piece of the original population, right?
Especially on food stamps, less so with the SSI, SSP folks.
Okay, so now the food stamps, they have done that same thing. We started out servicing only seniors and children. They finally went to giving food stamps to seniors and children, and now we're covering a different population. So on this one, if whoever is going to do any reduction in this arena, I mean, I'm thinking that the food stamp one for working age adults is tricky. I mean, is the piece that's left, right? I mean, these are working age adults that we're giving food stamps.
Good afternoon, Erica Lee from the Legislative Analyst Office. We are offering actually a more targeted variant to the proposal of the governor to actually eliminate CFAP.
The programs,
Yeah, we're looking at a more targeted population and retaining CFAP benefits for those families that are only receiving CFAP benefits. So as Mr. Belland was saying earlier, the families that are sort of multi-generational that may be receiving federal food stamps programs, they would no longer be receiving, if there were CFAP
eligible.
Yes, they would be cut. But
yeah, if somebody else in your household
is
is
receiving some
eligible
sort
for
of
federal food stamps,
coupon.
you should just take those. Yeah.
Yeah, so
I mean, you
that's
should
our
get a
more
separate
targeted
one.
option.
Do you know how many? I mean, what's that? The reduction.
According to the department, it's about half of the CFAP caseload. So we would see about half of the savings of the governor's proposal, about $17 million in budget.
I mean, I think that's the kind of thing. If people are overlapping benefits, I don't know. I mean, I just think there's some room to rethink. This was a state-only program. It was designed at a time when we were very frustrated that they were just, abandoning a very large population of legal immigrants. We've now got it down to a fairly small population in both cases. I'm a little more sensitive to the SSI issue, mostly because it's a different population than we're now serving with the food stamps because of the age issue.
The SSI population is a little more vulnerable in that they are aged or disabled.
But if they're living with family, why would they be eligible for the SSI?
Because I don't believe we don't deem the income of the most likely
household?
junior members of their family to them.
Well, we might have to do that.
I mean, that's essentially
If you're living in a
the
household.
concept of our proposal. There is either more deeming or sort of targeting and saying, well, if you're actually residing in a household, a much bigger household, you're just not eligible, regardless of whether we're deeming or not.
No, that makes sense.
So
all right, how many people would be on your single caseload?
I believe on the CAPI proposal, our approach, we can save about $34 million instead of the governor's 85. Depending, you could get more aggressive. You could sort of use both approaches. There's sort of living alone and deeming. And if you kind of sort of do both, you might even
But
be
if
able
I
to get
just
more
did
savings.
the living alone, about 34 million could be
That's
the
about
savings.
34. Yeah.
Okay, members, I think I misspoke a little earlier. The recommendation actually is to reject the proposals. Mr. De Leon, then Mr. Blumenfield.
Yeah, I would concur with you, Madam Chair. Thank you. I would reject this proposal. I think this is a very good Republican program, and I want to keep this program moving forward. It was Governor Pete Wilson, obviously, who originated this program, and it was Ronald Reagan, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. So the Republicans have done some really good stuff when it comes to immigration, and I want to keep this discussion alive without a doubt, but I would reject the proposal.
Okay, Mr. Blumenfield.
Thank you. First, I want to concur in terms of rejecting this proposal. I mean, we talked about bright red moral lines. This is one of those places where we're talking about life and death. I mean, the folks that, just to be clear with people, we're talking about legal, elderly, disabled folks who are in this country legally, and they've been served by this program, and you're pulling out the last vestige of hope that they have. And there's stories about people. I mean, I've read articles where these women will kill themselves after they don't get certain things. There was a couple articles last year about that. And in terms of the proposal about people living together, I'm very cautious about creating disincentives for families to stay together, because that's often how people get through these tough times. I mean, there's only so much water you can pour in the soup and still have there be nutrition in it. And if this family has a little bit of income and you're asking them to stretch it to this person, but if they go live on their own, then they can get some assistance. It doesn't make any sense to me. But since the proposal on the table is to reject it, I wholeheartedly support the proposal.
Okay, you've heard the Assembly side. What's the pleasure of the Senate side?
I mean, I just leave it open a minute to explore some of those, because we got these trade-offs going on. I mean, I'm not real excited about the notion of sending the regular SSI recipients more into poverty. So I mean, granted, this may not be that much savings, but I just think it's worth thinking about for a minute. I mean, genetically, I'm prone to reject, but I'm sort of troubled, but that there may be targeted options. So I
understand. There's a couple of other senators, I think, that wanted to be heard as well. Mr. Dutton and then Mr. Lowenthal.
Just one little question I got about page 21. Were we not going to go over any reforms in CalWORK?
No, we talked about a number of them, and we directed our staff to come back with that.
Okay, so we're holding this one open then?
Yes.
Coming back? Okay. I didn't realize. I was confused where we were going. I couldn't tell which one we were on.
No, we directed them to, we rejected the elimination and directed substantial savings to be found.
Yeah.
And I guess I also would just want to thank for the acknowledgement that Republicans do have heart. And I was always a little taken back that the Clinton administration actually cut the federal funds on this program. So, it's nice to know that you've given us acknowledgement for being compassionate conservatives. Thank you.
Mr. Lowenthal.
Well, it's nice to follow my compassionate colleague. No, I would be voting, if there was a vote to reject, I think this needs to be rejected. But since we're going to hold it open to look at options, I'm fine with that too. But just to put on the record, I would be voting to reject this. But I'll wait. It's fine.
Well, I understand that the CAPI rates are tied to the SSI rates, so if we take a cut in SSI, there's a corresponding cut in CAPI. Is that right? Is that the issue you were looking at?
You would get some of these savings. I believe the number that's in front of you is the net additional amount you get from the elimination. They've already taken. So this is what you would get in addition. So if you reject this, you don't get any of this.
In the interest of time, members, why don't we hold this open? We know that the Assembly is willing to move forward, but there are some substantial concerns on the Senate side. So let's do them the courtesy of getting the information that Mr. Cheney has requested as far as whether or not we can find some other savings there and move on. All right. On page 23, Health and Human Services realignment for savings of $550 million. Thank you. Dropping the zeros there. I hardly know where to start on this one. It's a big one, obviously. Perhaps, LAO, you could start out by answering the question in my mind, how solid are the savings that we're looking at on this page?
I mean, we would sort of view this as more a conforming issue. If you take deep reductions in home supportive services, CalWORKs, and other programs, there's going to be county savings as well. This proposal to us, although it's a changing of the sharing ratios, and we wouldn't necessarily even call it realignment, but essentially it's a way of capturing those savings by essentially then changing. So in our view, this is more conforming to your other actions. If you don't eliminate CalWORKs, counties don't get that savings. If you don't make deep reductions in IHSS, they don't get those. So
okay,
I think you tend to return to this depending on the degree to which you make other reductions that result in county savings.
Okay.
And also, our local government group has some broader thoughts, I believe, about realignment.
Got it. So depending on what we do in the other areas, we'll come back to this. So we'll hold that item open. Page 24, this is a legislative proposal, statewide fingerprint imaging system for a savings of $3.15 million. Since it doesn't come from the LAO or the Department of Finance, I don't know who to ask to start with this. Mr. Leno, good place.
Our auditor looked at this finger imaging system 1995. I think it was 94, 95, somewhere in there. And the determination was that there was virtually no fraud in the system. I think she went so far as to say that the approximately $32 million which was spent to create it was a waste of money, and that the annual costs of around $8 million to continue to run it was also a waste. And we've been trying to put an end to this in a modified fashion, just relative to food stamps, disregarding the costs associated with CalWORKs and other benefits that make use of it, only to meet a gubernatorial veto. But given that the auditor has spoken and said that this is not money well spent, given the seriousness of our fiscal situation, given that there are no more food stamps, we're talking, I know this measure before us is broader than food stamps, but with regard to food stamps, there are no food stamps to trade or to make nefarious deals with because of the electronic debit scheme, and that we have quality control systems in place as well. Everyone who applies must have a Social Security number. We match it against Franchise Tax Board and prison and death records, employment development. We've got some good systems in place. 48 other states have dropped this altogether because they were like-minded to our audit. How do we continue to defend this at this point?
A different way of thinking about the audit is that it confirms that deterrence works, and in some ways that's the goal and the focus of the system. The system is it aims to establish requirements that, by requiring applicants to have to fingerprint and knowing that that's going to be part of what we're doing, we are deterring potentially fraudulent claimants from coming and applying for the program. And we think that this program more than pays for itself in terms of the level of fraud deterrence that it results in.
So we have state welfare reform has established work requirements. And so if you were going to fraudulently try to double your benefit, you'd have to document twice the work requirements as well?
We also know that that the work participation is not exactly at the level as that the work requirements would require. We have a substantial number of the population in sanctuary status. We have other populations that are not meeting the work requirements. So while generally the issue has been raised that people are supposed to be subject to work participation requirements, and in order to be receiving duplicate aid, that have to be subject to twice the work requirements. We also know that we don't have 100% adherence to said work requirements, and we think that the system does its job very well.
If that's your strongest argument, and I'm going to tie you to it, then you would be able to document that in all of these other states that dropped it, they saw spikes in their levels of fraud. Correct? I mean, that's our fear, that we drop the system, we're going to see fraud increase. All these other states have dropped. Can you document that their fraud has increased?
I think we'd have to, in some ways, also look at an apples-to-apples comparison about what other systems the other states have in place. And we think in California this has worked. Many counties also use the CFAS system for purposes of general assistance and verifying potential duplicate aid fraud there as well, because they also believe that, that it works, and we think the system more than pays for itself.
Just to follow up, one of the few areas of raw data that we do have on this is LA County did a study a number of years ago on a similar system, and when we extrapolated the savings that LA documented statewide, it was found to deter over $60 million that otherwise would have gone fraudulently into the program.
And when was that done?
It was a number of years ago.
Many, many years ago, and we've put into place quality control systems since then, and switched to EBT, the electronic debit.
And this review was done after the BSA audit was concluded.
Okay. What I think would benefit the committee is if you could share with us what other states have in place. I believe that New York's governor, by executive order, has recently dropped it for the state of New York. They were the third last state to have it. Now it's just Texas and California which has this. So other states are doing something.
Well, one big difference between California and other states as well is other states have a single eligibility determination system, whereas California has the SAW system. So we currently have 4. It's going to go down to 3. But the point is these systems are distinct and do not talk to each other. So in other states, if you have one single system, that makes it easier to detect duplicate cases.
Just to reiterate, I think if you could help us with some apple-to-apple comparisons, or we're talking about enough money to save Hastings College of the Law. And
which is our primary goal, after all, right?
And we're talking upwards of $8 million, and that if there is a less expensive way, I'm not arguing in support of fraud. Is there a less expensive way for the state to secure our systems without continuing to invest in this system that our auditor says is a waste of money?
Sure. We understand your concerns, and just to clarify on the dollars themselves, this is the first, 2009-10 would be the first year that would reflect federal participation in this program. So that brings our general fund cost down to $4.9 million.
I understand that. And that also there is, I believe, a clear deterrent in eligible residents participating in our food stamp program. And again, I know it's not apples to apples, but we do rank, if not 50th out of 50 states, at the very bottom of all states. And we're leaving upwards of $2 billion of federal food stamp benefits on the table. So there's real reason to pursue some way other than this finger imaging system. And for those who may be eligible, it's, aside from the inconvenience of course, people who may be working 2 minimum wage jobs, not easily accessing state offices to go participate in the system, it does really communicate that there's something criminal about being poor and hungry.
Okay. Mr. De Leon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm a little perplexed, too, and I'll echo many of the comments that my colleague from the Senate side, Mr. Leno, just articulated. I'm not quite sure why is it that we make it so difficult and so cumbersome, and we place all these obstacles and landmines for folks who just want to get food for their children. If it's my understanding, and LAO as well as DOF, correct me if I am off base somewhere, but aside from the fingerprinting requirement we have in the state of California, we also have, and I'll go down the list, we have obviously the work requirements, we have the EBT card, and obviously we don't have any cash exchange, nor do we have what we used to have back in the day. And I can remember back in the day in my neighborhood, they used to have the food stamps, the coupons. We have the EBT card now, so that's highly secure electronic card. We have sophisticated data matches with the Franchise Tax Board, with the Social Security Administration, with the prison and death records, with employment development, with the county program participation, MEDS program, as well as a cross-state check via the IEVS system. We have vastly improved the quality control systems. We have improved the Social Security match, and now with the passage of the Real ID Act, it's almost like Fort Knox. Why we have to have still this fingerprint program is beyond me, especially when the USDA and the feds have said it's completely unnecessary. It's beyond me. I mean, I don't know why we just don't take the $8 million and we just let the program run itself out, and we just dismantle the system and we take the cost savings. So what I'd like to do, Madam Chair, is actually make a motion to actually defund the program and take the savings.
Members, we have a motion. Ms. DeCheney?
I'll support the motion. I think that was the intent of Senator Leno's comments as well. And I'll support the motion. I think we could score additional savings, because I'm wondering what the savings to the county workers who have to implement this system is. They could probably process, I mean, there should be a savings in the bureaucracy and or the administration of the programs at the county level in not having to do this. But somebody's going to have to think about that.
I'm not sure that impacts our general fund.
Anyway. Well, it does, and with all the cost shifting we're doing, we should at least know. Well, we got to pay the counties for administration of the program, so we pay for food stamp administration.
Good
I don't know if there's
what we've done. What the motion is to direct staff to take the savings. So that question has to be held open. Mr. Dutton.
Well, I for the life of me, I can't understand when we just got done with the in-home services one, and we know there's fraud, we know there's things going on, there's been grand jury investigations. This one here, you happen to have a program which actually is a fraud prevention. I'm just really I'm baffled as to why we now want to go ahead and go in that direction. I would suggest if you're going to head in that direction, you better score something for some fraud, because I think anybody who thinks there's not going to be fraud by not having this deterrent just isn't being realistic. Also, too, the controller just released new information that the revenues are $987 million below May revised estimates. And yet, just in the last few minutes or half hour, whatever it was, since we came back, we've rejected $1.7 billion in cuts. So I'm just want to remind everybody that the problem gets deeper.
Thanks for that reminder.
Oh, but the
I think
3
we
million, I got a feeling you're going
momentarily
to have more fraud. The fraud's going to more than eat the way that you're supposedly saving.
forgot. Okay, we have a motion on the floor.
And just to piggyback on Senator Dutton's comment, we do believe it would be appropriate to reflect a grant cost. I wouldn't suggest 60 million. That's an annualized figure, but it certainly is fair to assume that we would have increased grant costs due to fraudulent.
LAO has tended
This
to...
is federal food stamps.
And you're
for the most
eliminating the
part.
program on the CalWorks side, too, as we understand it. Your motion is to eliminate the
You
system.
think more that one person can get more than one CalWorks grant at a time, working 32 hours a week in both places?
We have child-only
I don't
cases
get
and
it.
people who aren't participating.
And
We agree that we believe the savings are substantially less than the 60 million, but we think, CalWorks is growing to be a $3.5 billion grant program. 1% is 35 million. 0.5% is 17. We've tended to think the cost of running the system at the 4 or 5
states not having this
million.
problem? I mean, I remember this discussion
Probably
about
wouldn't
this
build it
system
if we had to do all over again.
related
But
to
at,
food
but at
stamps.
these costs, I don't know. We would suggest not booking it as a savings, booking it as neutral if you get rid of it, because we think you get some lost deterrent effect. But you're in charge.
Why don't you score some of the other things as neutral? I mean, I can't believe it.
Well, and just one technical point, too,
one's hard to
there would be some decommissioning costs to actually dismantle the system. So you can't just zero it out no matter what. You
We
wouldn't be able to
understand
reflect.
it's complicated, but I don't think it's a zero sum. I don't think it's neutral. So
We
This
think
is-
it's a cost.
you
Well,
think
that's
it's
the
a
problem. They're
cost.
gonna
You think
score
it's
it against
We're
neutral.
willing to
because they don't
say,
like our
we're willing to
proposal,
say
they're
we
gonna score
can't
it
prove that
against
it
Right.
saves more, but we tend to think it's prudent to keep it. So we would say
Well, we
you
want
shouldn't
you
book
to-
a savings, but
If you're going to score that way finance, then you better score the cost of your CalWorks elimination proposal to the economy and the $125 million that we lose in sales tax. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You don't like the proposal, so now it's a cost. When we don't like the proposal, it's a savings. You can't have it both ways all the time. You're going to have to pick one.
And I could not agree more. And this committee has tried to also look at the ripple effects and the downstream effects of these proposals, the cost shifts. I mean, we're not scoring any cost shifts here. Why don't we do that? Okay, let's start looking at how many dollars we are shifting to nursing home costs when we're closing down IHSS and all these other programs that take care of people that encourage them to stay in their homes, which is a lot less costly, and build that into this. And if we're going to do this, I'm going to insist that we do that.
Let me ask one more other question that occurred to me, because Senator Leno's bills on this over time were mostly related to food stamps. And that's where every other state, everybody else says this is a dumb system. It never did anything to stop anybody from anything. It's a fully federally funded program. We have the EBT. And most of the problem in this is what it does to inhibit people from seeking food stamps, which are fully federally funded. We are the lowest food stamp taking state in the country, even though we have a higher poverty rate than most folks. So the question would be, if this program were limited to the CalWorks recipients, which is a much smaller universe than the food stamp recipients universe, what happens?
That's actually been, this has come up at conference before,
that's come
and an
up
LAO
before.
compromise position has been eliminated for food stamps.
And what do
keep
I
it
get
for
for that?
CalWorks.
Okay.
What's sort of ironic here is essentially the new federal funding stream they've identified here is a food stamp stream. So if you eliminated it for food stamps instead of sort of an annual cost of $5 million to run it, you'd be looking at $10 million. And I will concede that's a close call. Do we really think there's $10 million in deterrence? I'm quite comfortable that there's $5 million.
But only in CalWorks, not in
again,
food stamps. It's a deterrent to people seeking food stamps, which is a cost to the economy and to California farmers, which nobody wants to acknowledge.
The cost primarily would be on the CalWorks side. So there would be some, if there, to the extent that there's some loss of federal funds, there would be additional system costs. The concern that the biggest fiscal impact is in the CalWorks program, not in food stamps.
Ms. Lee, I've been told that you have a figure as far as the decommissioning costs.
Yes, the Office of System Integration provided us with a breakdown, and just at a high level, we're looking at, for decommissioning, about $359,000 for state staff decommissioning costs, potentially $230,000 for DTS telecom discontinuance charges, but the bulk of the decommissioning costs would come with the prime contractor and consultant services, and we're looking at about $1.8 million there.
All right, I think, but it doesn't all have to be taken down at once, correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that.
We're at a procurement stage, which is what this says. We would just not be getting into a contract. Where's
The current contract ends at the end of August of '09.
Okay, so when that ends, if we don't renew it,
then we wouldn't have to pay the ongoing cost of the maintenance.
Exactly.
But there are decommissioning costs if we were to.
We already have a contract for a new provider who is phasing in to replace the existing provider.
All right, we have a motion. We can do a lot of back and forth on this. Obviously, we're going to have to come back with some real numbers, and I realize, as the vice chair is pointing out, that there's going to be an attempt to score this as a positive number, which we will reject. So I need to have a vote. The motion is to defund this program and take the savings. 3-1 on the Senate side, 3-2 on the Assembly side. All right? Well, that was a lively discussion. Let's move on to page 25. My understanding is, 25 is CalWORKS and KinGap caseload for an additional cost of $501 million. My understanding is this is caseload issues that will conform to actions that we take elsewhere. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially, the only reason that essentially I think this was put on the agenda, you had another sort of vote only on all the caseload issues. The CalWORKS caseload is growing very fast right now, but there's a and the LAO is not saying there that necessarily to not accept the administration's caseload projection here, but it's a very close call. When we look at the March most recent actual caseload for CalWORKS and we look back a year, we see it grew by about 10% in that time period. But the projection is a 15% growth on top of that 10 into 9/10. And it also looks, as you look at the trends, like the number of new applicants, that rose. So we're getting a higher number of new applicants, but that's not continuing to rise. It is sort of leveled off, which basically means to then have a higher caseload growth on the same number of applicants means people would be staying on longer, which is also possible in a recession. We only pointed out to you, it's a fine line here between sort of a prudent look at the CalWORKS caseload and the impact of the recession and maybe slightly over budgeted. And so we just wanted to call that to your attention. You might make a different judgment than us on that. You know, it's about the reserve and risks and everything. It's a close call.
It sounds like we should leave this open.
I would think you'd want to leave it open until you make some final decisions on CalWORKS.
I thought it was related to CalWORKS. I just sort of thought of it as a conforming issue, but
Yeah, it is, and that's why I think we would leave it open until we make some final decisions on CalWORKS.
May I have a question?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Lowenthal.
Yeah, over the last number of years, the CalWORKS caseloads has decreased, right?
Yes, it decreased for many years. From 1995, essentially more or less unabated through about 06, with just the slightest uptick in the earlier recession, early decade. Even then, barely moved up at all.
So you anticipate that the increase is just a temporary increase?
Well, we haven't looked, the administration hasn't looked beyond the budget year. Our own thoughts are, it's a very interesting question about when will it grow more slowly in the future, or will it move back down? I think it depends on the nature of the recession and the economy.
In the last 10 to 14 years, over the last 14 years, it's shown a decrease in
Absolutely.
caseload.
Yeah, this is reflecting the bad economy. And
That's right.
I've been
That's
hearing
all
this
it's
anecdotally
reflecting.
locally.
I do
Right.
not. That's all it's reflecting.
Right.
And you mentioned that just recently it seems to have leveled off. Is that it?
Number of new applicants is higher. It went up, but that higher number of new applicants has leveled off. It isn't continuing. The number of new applicants is not continuing to go up every month.
It's like the decrease.
It moved up from about 35,000 to more like 50, but now it's been staying at 50 for a few months. So it's just they're projecting one more bit of historical perspective, and this came from the estimates binder. During the early 90s, another severe recession for California, the most it ever grew in 1 year was 12%.
Okay.
It's never grown by 15. We're just saying it's a close call here between over budgeting.
We're pushing the envelope in a whole lot of new ways here. Page 26, adjustments for federal stimulus. This is accepting the ARA funds. And again, this will conform to other actions, so it sounds like we should leave that open. All right, members, that concludes the human services portion of our agenda. And we can move on to public safety. We're going to take a 5-minute break in place while we change staff, and some of the senators had to go vote in committee. So we'll start up again in about 5 minutes. In committee, so obviously we won't be able to take any actions. We'll just have to keep them open, or we'll have to add them on. But at least we can get started on the discussions. We're on page 1 of the judicial branch. 10% unallocated reduction to general fund transfer to the trial court trust fund for savings in the May revise of $168.5 million. This is one that my office actually has been working very diligently with the administrative office of the courts to determine how it gets absorbed and how it gets implemented. It's not all that simple, given the fact there's statutory mandates, constitutional mandates, statutes of limitations, etc. So what I would suggest to the committee members, I'm not sure we have enough for votes here, what I was going to recommend is that we adopt this and that we continue working with the courts to determine how this actually gets implemented and absorbed. So what we'll do is we'll have to come back to this one, if you could make a note, for actual vote and action. Although, we have, I mean, if there's no objection, then I guess we could do it on a 3. Can we? Oh, good. Mr. Blumenfield is here. Mr. DeLeon. All right. So we've got a full contingent on my side.
Can we, I guess, Madam Chair, we would adopt the number but leave the
implementation open.
Right. So that, because there are a lot of issues there, and there should be a working group going on somewhere with sheriffs and court employees and courts and.
Yeah, my office actually has been working with with all the parties involved, and I was going to get to that in a later issue, because there are a lot of issues involved in this, and we're not seeing a whole lot of movement at this point, and so there's a lot of comments that I want to make as we go along for everybody concerned. But this is the initial action that I would, if somebody could make a motion, move to adopt, and then I will continue working with them to implement this, as well as other items down below.
So we would be adopting only the dollar savings and not the proposed plan. That would have to come back as trailer if there were to be, the court closure would require a trailer.
Right.
I don't know about the fund shifts, whether that requires trailer, but at least somebody needs to come back to us with an implementation plan,
right,
especially if such plan involves any trailer bill language.
Yes, and we did hear this in subcommittee in the Assembly.
I mean, dollars only, I can do it. That's fine. The dollar reduction.
The dollar amount, right. Because we're continuing to work on this. All parties understanding that the final action has to be taken on Monday. And there's a number of items, as I said before, that get more into the details here, and I'll talk about where we're at on them as we get to them. But the biggest issue, obviously, is the court closure for 1 day a month that's been proposed and how that gets implemented. And there may be, more to come. So there's a motion, I believe, or Mr. Milo?
I'd like to clarify. When you began speaking, I was being briefed on another issue, so I apologize for that. So are you talking about all of the judicial branch issues? No? Okay. Just page 1. And the action would be to
adopt the dollar figure. And we will continue working with the administrative office of the courts and the other parties that are involved in this, the sheriffs, SEIU, and others, because the first one of these suggestions as far as implementation is to close the courts 1 day a month. And that creates a ripple effect of other issues, contracts, and concerns about reduction in pay, and a whole lot of issues that come up.
That's what the courts are saying. That wouldn't be our action.
But we would not be approving that. We
right.
would be leaving that open.
We're leaving that open.
The way this, the item is, as proposed, is just a unallocated reduction.
So we would do that.
Right.
And is that indeed the action that you're proposing to take?
That is the action I'm proposing to take. We will continue working with the courts if there's trailer bill language or budget bill language that has to come back to us to implement any kind of
if they want to do things to implement this that requires additional legislative action, they will come back to us.
Yes. Yeah. the only thing we can actually do today is adopt the budget savings. And then there are other more specific items that are also related to cuts to the judicial branch that come up later in the agenda. Right. Okay? All right, so there's a motion. 3-0 on the Senate side. On the Assembly side, do I have 5-0? You're okay with this? Okay, so 5-0 to adopt that on the Assembly side. Page 2, electronic court reporting for a savings of $13 million. This one has been problematic for years, and speaking as a lawyer that's practiced at least in the civil trial courts, it's highly inappropriate to have electronic court reporting in very complex civil cases, and I would assume it applies even more so in criminal cases. And again, this proposal isn't really even ready for implementation. So personally, I would reject it. Other comments from other members?
I have some similar concerns. I guess it's my understanding that all of your savings comes from doing this in the portion of the court that is the most difficult place to implement it and the most dangerous place to implement it, which is in felony trials. Is that true? I mean, it's always seemed to me, but it's my understanding some courts are doing this. You can do this now in, arraignment courts, in trial setting courts, in family law order to show cause court, in law and motion court, in any place where you don't have major testimony. The electronic reporting is not as problematic. When you start getting it into complex felony or civil trials, as the chair points out, it's impossible and it doesn't work, and it's not a cost saving. It's a problem. It's a problem for developing records. It's a problem for the reporter to try to transcribe the thing. It's just all the way around problematic, and I think probably legally very difficult to sustain, certainly at the felony level. Felony trial level. It's one thing to say, again, if it's a plea bargain court, if it's drug court, if it's those kinds of courts, it's probably not as hard, but it's my understanding they have some discretion to be able to do that now. Am I wrong?
Drew Soderborg.
Let's get an answer, and then we'll go to Mr. Lowenthal.
Drew Soderborg, Legislative Analyst's Office. The courts do have some ability to use it if a court reporter isn't available, and in some very limited case types. As far as its viability in criminal and in other case types, it has been used successfully across a range of case types, including criminal in other states and in the federal judiciary.
What did he just say? Sorry, what did you say?
I was just saying in reference to whether or not it's effective in criminal case types and in complex civil case types. It's been used in other states in all sorts of different case types, including criminal case types, and they've done so successfully. And it's used in the federal judiciary and criminal case types as well.
We have different data then, because there's a lot of the folks that testified here last week all said that all those states abandoned it after they tried it for a minute and a half.
We actually followed up. I believe the testimony was that it had been tried in New York, New Jersey, and Illinois, and New Mexico, and had been abandoned. We followed up with each of those, and in each of those cases, with the exception of New Mexico, they continued to use it. We actually also looked at a National Center for State Courts report from 2004, and electronic court reporting is used in every state with the exception of Colorado to some extent.
Well, we use it here, too, to some extent. And the question, if there is a prohibition on using it except when somebody's not available, that would be worthy of possibly looking at. But again, I think if you're going to do this, you have to restrict it to those courts where you're not taking trial testimony, whether civil or criminal. I just don't think it works in a trial. It works for law and motion, order to show cause, small claims, the trial setting, arraignment kind of courts, but I don't think it works in trial courts.
Mr. Lowenthal?
Well, then, hearing that, I'm just wondering, do you want to leave it open so that we would identify those limited cases, examples of, you pointed out, non-felony, criminal, possibly?
Well, no, it's already being used in those areas.
Okay.
This proposal would be to open it up to everybody.
I'm not talking about
And-
this proposal.
yeah.
I'm just saying, I just said, if we're not into adopting this proposal.
No.
The question is, are there any benefits to doing this? That's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
Not
and
being
actually,
alarmed.
what the sergeants just passed out to you was trailer bill language that was passed, was adopted in the Assembly Subcommittee. So we did consider this in our subcommittee, and we adopted trailer bill language
Okay.
for your consideration. So that's what my recommendation would be, is to reject this proposal and adopt the trailer bill language. And just one other comment, this is one of those areas where I kind of have to take a look at this and say, we're going to implement a whole new program throughout the entire state of California judicial branch, and yet we're saving $13 million. So this is, kind of follows up on the conversation we had in the last item. Yeah, the scoring issue, where I don't see it, and I don't buy it. Having done this for many, many years professionally. Yes, go ahead.
Just to note, Jennifer Osborne, Department of Finance, the proposal with the savings would actually increase as each
no, I understand
courtroom rolled out. It wasn't just the 13.
You know, but this is the flip side of the prior
Theoretically.
conversation, okay? What is the cost of buying the equipment and installing it in the courtrooms? And if you're in a rural courtroom and you don't have, I mean, what is the cost? How are you getting savings out of this?
The savings are actually net of the costs. We would note that recent information has come forward that some of the cost estimates maybe are that we used in the estimate were somewhat old, so there may not be, the savings estimate may not be as high in the first year, but the proposal was savings net of costs. Those were accounted for.
But aren't all your savings related to doing felony trials?
I don't think it's all.
The savings would be we estimated the savings from a pilot project that took place in California in the early 90s that did a per courtroom savings.
Oh, well, that would be relevant data.
And
the 90s?
In the early 90s, this was tried in California, and we did an inflation adjusted analysis of the savings done there, and that the savings estimated there was on a per courtroom basis, and so we didn't do any adjustment for case types. It was on a per courtroom level of savings.
The actual equipment used by court reporters has changed significantly since the 1990s. So, I mean, just, you can't. Sorry. I spent 25 years in the courtroom, okay, in civil cases. This doesn't work. I can guarantee it. And at least not on the level that's being proposed, to be fair. So there is a proposal that the members have. My recommendation, as I said, is to reject this, adopt the trailer bill language. The current law does allow electronic court reporting to be used under certain circumstances. Trailer bill language would broaden that somewhat to allow, excuse me.
I don't know if I'm ready to adopt the trailer bill language. I'm prepared to reject the governor's proposal. I don't, because I don't believe the numbers and I don't think it works, but I'm not prepared to adopt the trailer bill because we haven't seen it till just now.
Then you can take the time to look at that. That's fine.
I don't see the need for the trailer bill language either. I mean, I'd have to explain why we would even need it, so.
Okay, that's fine. It'd be nice if we could take some action just to simply reject it, and then it's clear what we've done. So do I have a motion to reject the proposal?
Motion to reject.
So moved.
No.
Okay, that's
No.
3-2 on the Assembly side and 3-1 on the Senate side. All right, moving right along. Page 3, the trial court security for an additional cost of $28.4 million. This is another problematic issue, members. Trial court security expenses are going up rapidly. This is another one of the issues that I've been trying to address between the sheriffs and the courts. I have to simply say publicly, I thought we were making some progress, and then it seems that we're not, which is extremely disturbing because this committee has to take action by Monday. This proposal would increase the current court security fee by $7 from $20 to $27. So, Department of Finance, would you like to start us off on this?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This proposal was originally included in the governor's budget, and what it would call for is, as you stated, a $7 increase to the court security fee. It would generate approximately $28.5 million in revenue and would essentially cover what is a shortfall in the trial court security budget. This amount wouldn't cover the whole shortfall, but it was over the past couple of years, there have been kind of one-time fixes to that shortfall, and this was meant to provide at some level at least an ongoing stable funding source. In addition to this proposal, we had proposed trailer bill language that would provide staffing standards for the courts. Right now, there is no consistent staffing standard, and because they use the sheriffs, there's kind of different levels of staffing throughout the state. And so what we had hoped would be that if we could come to a staffing standard and then also come up with a methodology that kind of included what costs would be paid for in the contracts with the sheriffs, that we would at least be able to provide for cost containment in the future from the existing requirement that they use the sheriffs.
Yeah, and I have to say that I share the concerns that you've just articulated, and those are the issues that I'm trying to find some progress on. The court security costs are expanding dramatically, and I'm completely sympathetic to the concern and the needs of the courts for security and the attempts for the sheriffs to provide that security. I mean, almost every county in the state has had shootings both inside the courtroom and outside the courtroom, inside the courthouses and outside, and there's witnesses and jurors and people that are completely unrelated to the people involved in the incidents that are at risk in our courthouses. And the problem seems to be, rather than getting less bad, it's as people face more and more pressures, it's getting worse. So I understand the problem that we're facing and the need for increased court security, but at the same time, we've got to be able to get some kind of handle on this, and that's what I'm attempting to do, and I'm getting to the point where I'm willing to take some drastic actions in order to do that. Ms. Ducheney?
Well, this has been going on for a long time, and we're back to the eternal problem of somebody else negotiates the contract and we pay the bill. This case, the sheriffs. It goes back to the counties, but when we took the courts, we unfortunately didn't figure out how to create a state court security force. We started out, some of us with marshals and some with sheriffs, and now we've got everybody on sheriffs, which was some form of uniformity. But every county negotiates separately. Every county board of supervisors negotiates their own sheriff's rates, regardless of the impact on the courts. Doesn't consider that. And we just are asked to pay the bill. I don't know how to, if we want to get more radical, to think about how to change that dynamic. There should be a court security force. It is convenient to use sheriffs locally as that force, but as court security officers, they ought to have, I don't know if it's a separate bargaining unit or a separate way of dealing. They should not be able, I mean, the issue for many years, and I don't know how prevalent it still is that it's pretty clear from some of the contracts and the way some of them were structured that sheriffs are basically subsidizing their basic sheriff's operations off of the courts. And now that it's the state court-run program, we're going to have to figure this out. I don't really like just continuously forever increasing the civil filing fees, which is what we've done, year after year after year. Last year for court construction, and and we do need to deal with court security. I know the courts need the funding for this, but the reason they need the funding is because we have no control over the costs. I don't know whether we can require that there be a statewide rate, and this is what we contract with sheriffs for. I mean, this is what we pay for court security officers. I don't know what your trailer bill, I have not seen trailer bill language that you may be proposing. And what is the proposed way of containing growth that you have? And the other final question for finance is, having done the unallocated reduction, isn't sort of the court security wrapped into the implementation proposal for the courts rather than as a separate proposal like this?
At this time, we don't have a specific implementation proposal for the unallocated.
No, I understand, but when that comes forward, wouldn't that include security?
At some level, my understanding is part of the closure that has been discussed would save on security costs, but we haven't seen anything.
And where's your trailer bill? What is your trailer bill language that?
This trailer bill actually was proposed in the governor's budget, and it's identical to trailer bill language that was approved last year as part of the budget. Unfortunately, it was placed in an omnibus trailer bill that didn't pass for unrelated reasons. And so this really is just trailer bill that was worked on last year as well.
What does it do?
It establishes, as I said, a staffing standard across courtrooms, and then also provides, basically explicitly states which things can be included which things the state will pay for in a sheriff's contract. So what it attempts to do is to provide an average cost, so that instead of paying for either a sheriff with many, many years of experience, a higher cost, because potentially those guys get paid more than a brand new person, it would just establish an average cost based on the sheriff's
what we pay for court
personnel
security.
budget.
Mr. Nielsen and Mr. Nilo.
I understand there's an automatic cost of living COLA attached. Couldn't that be just eliminated instead of suspended? I understand it's been suspended. Couldn't we just get rid of the COLA as one step?
The only, are you referring to the SAL?
Yeah.
The SAL, state appropriations limit increase for the courts, is proposed to be eliminated. That wouldn't affect the court's security contracts, because those contracts are with the county, are between, they basically pay for, basically SAL was what they were using in some cases to pay for the increases in sheriff costs. So us eliminating the SAL actually puts them in a situation where right now they have no control over what the sheriffs cost them, and then now we are eliminating their future growth, funding growth.
Does the state have to mandate how they conduct their security operations? Couldn't we give the counties the latitude to determine how they contract and who they contract with for security? They have that security. They don't have that opportunity now, do they?
Under current law, they're for the most part required to contract with sheriffs, or sheriffs are required to provide security.
Yeah, maybe that needs to be examined. Is that the best way? I'm not sure.
Doesn't the LAO's office have a recommendation on that? It came up in subcommittee.
What is your recommendation?
Yeah, that's correct. We've recommended for several years, including this year, that the courts transition to competitive bidding for the provision of security services. And that way it would give the courts an ability to control who's providing the security, the level of security, and the cost of that security to a greater extent. And we've estimated that if the courts were to transition to competitive bidding for court security, we'd not only contain costs, but we could actually create about $20 million in savings if we were to transition 20% of courtrooms to this, to this form of security provision. And on full implementation, it could save in excess of $100 million annually.
And why would we save such a substantial number of dollars?
The primary reason for the savings is because the courts would be able to, a lot of the savings would be driven by how competitive private security companies are. And so to the extent we are able to save money, a lot of it would be driven by employing security individuals who are paid less than sheriff's deputies.
What about a security standard so each locale would adopt its own security standards then? How much security, what type of security, electronics, whatever? Is that how that works now?
I think that's how it works now. To some extent, the courts do. The sheriff is really in the driver's seat now as far as the level of security provided to the courts. An individual court has to enter into an MOU with the sheriff, and in that MOU, the staffing standards are worked out. But it's certainly possible that if we were to give them more latitude, there would be
private
savings.
Security or marshals are also options for this security. Is that correct?
We think that if there was a competitive bidding service under that framework, marshals are generally court employees, and competitive bidding would generally rely on private firms or other public peace officer organizations. But certainly an alternative proposal would be to create a marshal's service.
Okay, well, I don't have any axe to grind with sheriffs providing it. I think they do a fine job, but it ought not be a means to subsidize the department if that's what's happening. Thank you.
Mr. Nilo.
Mr. Nielsen got it exactly the point that I wanted to discuss.
Thank you. Mr. Nielsen, these are all issues that came up in subcommittee. We did discuss them, and they're not generally things that I would favor, but as I said earlier, I'm getting to the point of frustration with trying to find some suitable and agreeable compromise here. And so what I would suggest is that we hold this issue open. I initially favored it, was willing to adopt it, but given the fact that we're not moving in negotiations, I would prefer to leave it open for now, if that's okay with the rest of the committee. Then we'll move on to page 4, California Emergency Management Agency. I believe this is accepting federal money. Department of Finance.
This was an April 1 finance letter which would recognize the federal ARA funds that were granted that are expected to come to California from the Byrne grant. It's approximately
accepting. Well, they have costs and everything.
$67 million in 9-10, and then that's about it. And then the same amount in 10-11, and so it's about $132 million total for local assistance. We had proposed this, and it's our understanding that there's been the CCJ, the California Council on Criminal Justice, has recently made a statement of principles that they intend to work with the legislature on basically determining how these funds will be allocated.
Okay, so did you want to ask a question? So this item should remain open, right? All right. Without objection, then, members, we can move on to page 5. Department of Justice, this is an LAO proposal to charge forensic lab fees for a savings of $20 million. Since it is an LAO proposal, perhaps you could start us off with a brief description.
Yes, under current law, DOJ operates 11 full-service laboratories that service approximately 46 out of the 58 counties. The balance of the counties provide their own laboratory service. Because we feel that the provision of forensic laboratory service is a local responsibility, we would recommend that DOJ begin charging the counties that are currently served by its labs for its lab fees. And as was mentioned, we feel that there would be about $20 million of savings for this in the first year, and upon full implementation, there'd be about $40 million in savings.
You said 36 counties have their own labs?
46 are the numbers serviced by DOJ, so 12 is the number that have their own lab.
Oh, okay. I had the other way around, but that's all right. So 12 counties have their own labs.
That's correct, and those tend to be the larger, more urban counties.
Mr. Cheney?
Just 2 questions, I guess. This kind of goes with one of our pet themes, and as we get to local government maybe, but it's the subventions question. How much do we keep paying of other people's bills? We appreciate that local government needs to be there, and counties in particular do a lot of work on behalf of the state, but there are places. Now, I know I have gotten letters from small counties, and I think there's a lot of concern that folks couldn't afford this, but I'm not quite sure how we got in the, I sort of get how we got in the business, but the 12 counties then are paying their own freight. 12 counties, and I assume all the cities within those counties use their county lab as opposed to the state lab. So some folks are paying their own freight, and other folks we're subsidizing. I can appreciate we might have to phase this in some fashion for some of the smaller counties and cities to, I don't know, I was playing around with percentage things. I support charging some kind of fees. I don't know whether everybody could handle the sudden move to all of it at one time. Although they get to, I don't know, finance.
For the record, we don't support this proposal. We believe that shifting to requiring the counties that currently use the DOJ labs to pay for the services would result in an unequal administration of justice. That essentially, if they don't have enough resources to pay for the forensic services, that there'd be essentially 2 tiers of justice being carried out.
So you don't think that's a problem in child welfare, but you think it's a problem in sheriff's costs? You don't find that to be problematic in cutting child welfare workers so counties can't administer justice equally in that arena?
In the child welfare area, we were looking at doing a reduction across the board, not some of the other reductions that were more targeted to particular counties. I think our concern here is for many of the same reasons why the state decided to have trial courts be basically a state-funded system, that this kind of is consistent with that. If we don't
except
have
for the 12 counties who pay our own freight. And that we don't care about. The 12 counties pay their own freight with their own local funds, but 46 counties don't have to do that.
It's our understanding that some of those counties that have their own labs also occasionally turn to the DOJ lab. I think it's not as clear cut as that they're just using their own labs, but
There are cases, we talked to DOJ about this, and there are cases where some of the 12 counties have used DOJ labs if their labs are overburdened for whatever reason, but it only makes up a small fraction of DOJ's total workload.
So what if we
only about
scaled,
8%.
I mean, I don't know what the impacts are, and I realize some of the smaller counties are where this is the most problematic, but what if it was scaled, and if you're a county undersize something, you pay 25% of the cost of the service. If you're bigger, you pay 50%. I don't know. It just seems wrong that it's free. And I don't, I can appreciate that there may be some issues with going to 100% overnight, and I don't know. I'd like the $20 million in savings, but I'm not quite sure it's realistic in the sense of some folks have pending issues. But I wish somebody'd go forth. Mr. Nielsen, I don't know. You represent some of the smaller counties, too.
All counties are not created equal.
Well, but so then I don't have an issue with kind of slide and scale or trying to figure out how to phase it, but I am a little bit bothered by the notion that we have to subsidize not only their local law enforcement and their property tax and their booking fees and their court, and their sheriffs through court security fees and the lab costs. I mean, either we, either do away with theirs and give us the money from the state and local city, county and city property tax, or do your own law enforcement.
It would have to be in some kind of a way taking into account the difference in revenue sources of counties. Some just don't have the economic base. Even medium-sized counties, what I call suburbanizing counties, would be so oppressed. Quite often, particularly smaller counties, have to come before this legislature with separate appropriation bills for very costly individual trials. I've carried some of them myself in years past, so there would have to be some kind of a sliding scale if we were to have any at all. I don't know that we've got time to come up with anything like that this quickly. It's an idea that certainly warrants discussion. But.
Well, I'm ready to take this, even though my counties would be adversely impacted. To me, it's an issue of equity, and I understand not all counties are created equal. Some counties have more resources than others, but it is a matter that, some counties are providing their own services and not having to pay, not being a burden on the state, and other counties are. And to me, this charging a fee makes perfect sense. So I don't know where everybody else is, but I'm willing to take this.
The only thing I would add real quickly is that there are options for hard-pressed counties. One is that I know the FBI provides free lab service, including providing witnesses at trials. So if there was a particularly expensive or catastrophic case in a small county, they could turn to the FBI for that. And the other thing I would note is that some small counties, if it takes too long for DOJ to process their samples, we've talked to some that have ended up submitting them to other counties and paying for the service to get it done on time.
They're already doing some of that. Mr. Lowenthal?
Yeah. In understanding this more, is there a difference between which counties have their own lab facilities? Is it the larger counties that have the lab facilities? And do they then sometimes use the state facilities too at no charge, and so when they're overloaded or they need, so everybody is using the state. So even those counties that may have their own facilities, if we adopted this, we would still charge if they use the state facilities in any way. So it'd be all 58, right? Is what we're saying. Okay, so most of the larger counties have and pretty much do all the work themselves. Is that the way it works, except when they need to use the state facilities? So it is going to impact. Getting back to your point, it is going to, Assembly Member, impact the smaller counties. Is really where this impact will be.
Well, if we were to adopt this, you would have to come back with, somebody would have to come back with trailer bill language that would show us how this would work. Is there an opportunity there to look at some kind of sliding scale? Perhaps I'm not advocating that, but it sounds like that's a concern of the Vice Chair and perhaps some others here.
It would be something that we could look into for sure.
I mean, I guess I'm reading this. It says they already have the authority to charge fees. And
That's
what
correct.
is it that has prohibited them or inhibited them from doing so in the past?
Right now, they have the authority. They've just chosen not to exercise it. There are some cases where they do charge fees. So in the case of blood alcohol tests or toxicology tests, fees are charged. But in those cases, a specific funding stream was provided to local law enforcement to pay for those costs.
So there is a funding stream local law enforcement gets, and then they pay for that. I guess what I'm asking is what would we be doing here? Just lowering the budget of the agency and
It's a reduction of the Department of Justice that would be
Forcing them to backfill
backfilled
the fees.
by fees to the extent that the fees are paid and that they charge the fees. If not, it would be an unallocated reduction of DOJ.
So then the DOJ we could give direction to adopt some sort of fee schedule. I mean, we don't have to do that here, right?
helps.
We can take the cut.
So where do we think
And
the
direct
20
them to do it.
million? How do we get the number 20 million then?
20 million was based, the total budget that they spent on laboratory service for this year is about $40 million. And so 20 million represents half their general fund laboratory budget.
So that's just kind of a number.
We put it in at half just to account for the fact that they would have to develop a fee schedule and it'd take some time for them to roll out
That's how you get to the 40 in the out years?
That's correct.
I'm just wondering whether that's an appropriate unallocated cut for the first year in that sense, because it's not a developed notion of what the actual cost of the fees are.
One thing that they could do, DOJ has expressed concerns in the past about what if counties don't end up paying for these, how would we be able to collect? And we could look at various, other sources that we use to send counties funds, whether it be Prop 172 or whether it be the VLF, and get DOJ paid from those fund sources prior to them being sent down to the counties.
But after they adopt a fee schedule and have maybe a hardship exemption or something that
That's
we could send to
correct,
a fund? How do we, like we do the murder trial thing, how do we do that thing?
The payments to counties for cost of homicide trials, statute stipulates what are allowable expenses and how much can kick in, but they have to submit requests to the state.
Yeah, but we could design something like that has like a hardship fund. You got some really complex murder case that's going to break, the county. I mean, similar to how you do a homicide trial, you could set up a fund like that and criteria, and DOJ could figure out the criteria and the fee schedule and come back to us if it's problematic. I don't know that 20 million is the right number under those circumstances, though.
Mr. Dutton?
Well, I was just noticing, taking a look at some of the other things we're going to be considering. Is there actions that we're going to be looking at later on in public safety that may have a bearing on the kind of use and impact this may have on some of these counties? I mean, are we anticipating some of these things could actually perhaps increase some activity out there in this particular area for the law enforcement community? So has anybody looked at this in comparison to everything else and in the totality like we're doing with some of the other items?
Our analysis, that we didn't look at the potential for other interactions with other proposals.
Would there be an opportunity here? You mentioned privatization or contracting out. Is this another option for these counties? Could they go to the private sector and also arrange for these kinds of services and stuff? There wouldn't be anything in state law right now that would prevent them from doing that?
No, and currently counties will occasionally use private laboratories to check if there's been a question raised about the work done at the state or work done in another laboratory.
So explain to me how you're scoring the savings then.
So the savings was scored by, basically the way it would work is we'd reduce DOJ's budget by this amount, and then DOJ would collect fees to backfill that amount.
So this is a given deduction from DOJ?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Cheney, did you have a suggestion?
Yeah, no, I
close
think
this
I'm
out?
okay with that now that I understand the $20 million figure. So it's really half of what, at the moment, we
It's
presume
half
to
of-
be the cost. So I could live with that. I'm not sure I want to go to the place where they're paying 100% of the fees, but I'd rather see the fee schedule first, and it comes back next year, and once they've established it and we see what they could reasonably get and think about these hardship issues and possible sliding scales, but asking DOJ to go forward and develop a fee schedule, I don't think that's wrong, and maybe it's only 20 million every year. At least we're paying half or something for folks, but I think it's worthy of trying to to establish that it's not a free service, and that, you know, local government revenues, when the state doesn't have revenues, it's not right for us to not fund the programs we have an obligation to fund and to continue to subsidize programs for which we shouldn't have the obligation. So subsidizing at some level is right so that we have a statewide system that's fair justice. I mean, that issue. But I think if we do the 20, and I don't assume the 40 in the future without relooking at this next year.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Mr. Leno?
Thank you. I appreciate the direction the committee's going. I would concur. I don't think, I had to step out for a moment, but have we asked the question yet, when did the state get into this situation? How did this begin? The question is, can we continue to afford it?
The state began, the current configuration started in 1972. That's when the state started providing laboratory service to the locals. And prior to that, the locals had done it.
And footing 100% of the bill?
Yes, that's correct.
Given that was the case, when did these 12 or so counties decide they were going to establish their own labs and pick up their own costs?
If I recall correctly, these counties had already established, a lot of these counties had already established. 72. That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
These are all the large.
Okay. Mr. Cheney, did you want to make a motion to adopt what you just laid out for us?
Yeah, the motion would be to adopt the reduction of $20 million with direction to the Department of Justice to develop a fee schedule for local lab services, and somehow you're probably going to have to do trailer bill language that we'll want to see to try to figure out how to set this up. Some direction to them to consider, I mean, based on the conversation today. But more than that, have them bring back, you know, we'll know in January what kind of schedule they're looking at and whether the number's realistic as an achievable goal for the future to get fees. I mean, it doesn't assume 100%, but it assumes that there is a fee schedule.
All right, members, that's the motion.
Yeah, are you, so is the fee schedule going to come back for us to review, to take a look at?
January, whenever they get around to it.
Yeah, the direction would be the department to develop it, and it would come back to the legislature
Hopefully
later.
by the time of the January budget, should there be such a unique creature this year.
I think I'm going to have to hold off right now. I mean, the concept I'm not necessarily opposed to. I just like to see more detail before I've still got a problem with wanting to make sure that we aren't putting smaller counties, which isn't necessarily my case. I want to make sure we aren't creating a Wild West type situation in the small counties. So I just, you know, a little concerned about that.
So on the Senate side, we have 3 ayes and 1 abstention. On the Assembly side, we have 3 ayes and 2 noes. All right, on page 6, Department of Justice, again, an LAO proposal to reduce the Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement funding for a savings of $20 million. You guys like that figure, $20 million.
Why are
There's
they
a little
cutting
theme
that
here
down?
going. Would the LAO like to start off with a brief presentation on this proposal, please?
Yes, we do propose the 20 million figure represents half of the Bureau of Narcotics general fund budget. And we propose reducing this by half because, again, narcotic enforcement is a local responsibility. And we feel that we should prioritize state dollars for state responsibilities. We also know that to the extent that this impacts locals' ability to address drug enforcement in their communities, there is a significant amount of additional burn grant money that's available. Specifically, there's $90 million in ARA funds going directly to the locals. And there's $135 million coming to the state, and a large portion of that will end up going to the locals. And then on top of that, on an ongoing basis, the baseline burn grant funds have been increased both to the state and to the locals. So there are additional revenues coming from the federal government that could be used to help offset the impacts of these cuts.
Like schools. Move the LAO.
Mr. Dutton.
Yeah, I have some really concerns about this. We all know what's going on down in Mexico with the war on drugs, and we know how that's going on right now. To take resources out, I think this is one of those bright red moral lines that my colleague is always referring to, and I do think this is fiscally irresponsible and legislatively is going to put people at risk. So I just think this might be the wrong way to go. As a matter of fact, we've got legislation right now being proposed by Senator Wright regarding making Sudafed even something that you have to get with the by prescription because of its use in meth and so forth. So, like I said, I'm having some real serious issues with this. I think this may end up being that's a bad fiscal decision and putting people at risk.
We have a motion, members. Mr. Ducheney?
Just a brief response. In normal years, Senator Dutton, I might not be inclined to do this because I do appreciate what's going on in the task forces. However, this year, just like in schools, just like in Medi-Cal, just like in some of the other programs that we've talked about, there are substantial federal dollars with which to backfill this. If that were not the case, I may question the half, or maybe we'd reduce it or do it in some other way. But at this point, I'm not at all convinced that they won't get this much and more out of the burn grants. As far as I can tell, they're going to get more than this $20 million out of their Southwest Border Drug Task. There's a lot of new money coming in, particularly aimed at this. All of that's going directly to locals, not to the state. And I doubt that the program will actually be impacted by this general fund reduction.
Mr. Leno.
Thank you. I concur with Senator Ducheney's comments, and wanted to ask the LAO, these dollars currently are supplementing what are otherwise considered local law enforcement activities.
That's correct.
And so, not unlike with the last item, how long have we been doing this? What's the history of it?
The B&E has been in existence in DOJ since about 1927. As far as all the individual functions that we're carrying out now, those have, I'm not sure about the exact dates of all of the various task force and that sort of thing. But B&E as a unit has been in DOJ since 1927.
So I think, again, we have to be considering this is expansion of government. It may have made sense at one time. Does it make sense in this severe crisis, or at least to what extent? But I'm going to support the motion. Thank you.
I was curious, you mentioned something about federal. Is there going to be language that's going to backfill it then from the feds?
Well, I think when we get back to some of these other ones that are on here, we talked about the one set of burn jag money that we just passed that we haven't done yet. And like I said, I don't know all the detail of some of the ones that are going directly to the locals, but I know there's Southwest Border crime money, there are several other law enforcement grants going to local government right now, but I don't
Could the LAO's office get...
We wouldn't be doing this on a permanent basis. This is a one-year reduction. This program's always available, right?
We would just note that while this program does provide a sort of an augmentation to provide coordination with local law enforcement, that this reduction would result in the reduction of DOJ staff. And so to the extent that they're not going to get federal funds to backfill, then there would be a number of special agents whose positions would be eliminated. So it's not
How many people work at DOJ?
There are 185 of 233 agents are funded from the general fund, and so in B&E, so this would be a large proportion of them.
Just within this department, but they have thousands of employees. You're telling me they thought this was a priority, they couldn't reorient them?
They do. We just wanted to point out that this isn't kind of a cut to locals that can be backfilled with federal funds. This is a cut to state staff.
And the state staff aren't eligible for the burn money as part of the task force?
Well, they provide the coordination for the task forces, so the task forces maybe, but if the cut is to DOJ's budget, then it would essentially eliminate a number of positions.
The burn jag funds also have non-supplantation requirements, so to the extent that you were making a general fund reduction, I don't know that we'd be able to backfill it.
But you're
with
telling me
those
that
funds.
the sheriffs and those guys don't know how to coordinate themselves at a local level? They need us to do it for them?
I think we're noting that there's a substantial number of special agents in the Department of Justice that are funded with this general fund source, so there would be a programmatic impact at the state level with this level of reduction. But also note that to the extent that the other reduction, that $20 million reduction that the committee just adopted in the other area is not backfilled with fee revenues, that's another unallocated reduction to the Department of Justice.
And that was part of my concern when we start unraveling pieces of this. We might want to make sure what the total effect is before we actually go forward. And that was the reason I was concerned about adopting some of these changes at this time.
Mr.
Also,
Blumen?
you had some
Oh.
jurisdictional problems, too, that you run into, and probably as well, that DOJ would come in, and could you go cross county lines and things, so you have a whole bunch of other issues, too, probably.
Mr. Blumenfield?
I think I'm trying to get at the same question everyone is in terms of what does this cut really mean in terms of overall percentage? Is it because there's other money coming into the state for Bureau as well, right? So what is the 20 million as a percentage of the overall budget?
As a percentage of the overall Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement budget, it's 50% of their budget.
It is 50%, even with the augmentations and everything else?
It's 50% of their general fund budget. There's
but I mean, if they're, I know that some of the burn money goes to the locals, but they get additional. The State Department also gets additional federal
They do
money.
get some. It's not clear what they would be slated to get of the money.
I mean, is it a
the more recent
substantial?
money.
Is it going to change it from 50 to 30, or is it just? Are we just talking about on the margin here?
We'd have to go back and look at that. We just know that of the big RO burn grant that's coming out, they're not essentially necessarily slated to get the Department of Justice to get anything new.
But they'll get some,
they do get
and they always
something
get some federal grants. I mean, even forget the ARA, they always get federal money every year. So the general fund is only a portion of their overall budget, right? Do we know what portion of their overall budget the general fund is?
I'd have to go back and get that information. We do know that essentially it's funds about 75% of their positions, and so but the extent to which how their budget laid
out. The general fund funds about 75% of the
agent positions in B&E.
Positions.
Yes.
And we don't know if the positions, if that's the major expense that they have, so that would mean they're about 75% overall, or are there other expenses that more federal money goes into?
I would have to go back and check and get you that information.
Okay.
I don't have that information.
So the 20 is not really 50%. It's really of the overall. It's obviously going to be
No, it's
much
50%
less.
of their general fund budget.
Right, but of their overall budget, if their overall budget is only 75% general fund, then it's obviously, corresponding to be 15%.
We can get that information.
Mr. Lowenthal, did you have something?
Follow up on Assemblymember Bloom. Comments. It would be helpful for us to see an overall package of what their budget is if we're going to cut 50% of their general fund and just the narcotics division. I'm only talking about the narcotics division. What monies? Because I agree, we're not just talking about ARA money. There is a lot of other ongoing grants that they may be eligible for or receive. That it would be just helpful for us to understand that, not as we move forward.
Yeah,
no, I'm still into doing this. I'm
Okay.
just saying I'd just like to.
So I think we have a motion to vote on. And the motion is to approve this.
Absolutely.
Okay. So on the Senate side, 3 ayes, 1 no. On the Assembly side, 3 ayes, 2 noes. All right. Moving on to page 7. Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Division of Litigation Prevention. I'm advised this is a Nielsen proposal.
It is indeed one
All right,
that's
then
been
would you like to
longstanding.
start us off?
Well, the greatest out-of-control cost in corrections has been litigation. And the typical pattern has been reluctance to deal with these issues, which has resulted in classes becoming expanded and settlements becoming more egregious. And my thought is that there are some positions there that could be redirected for not the what was called, I believe, the Office of Court Compliance, and that is needed in terms of the existing receiverships, but rather a unit would be focused with and staffed with individuals, and particularly attorneys, who understood the Prison Litigation Reform Act and who understood legal vulnerabilities, and their mission would be to survey the institution, the entirety of the institution of CDCR, anticipate legal vulnerabilities and correct them through regulation, through statute, through policy, through training, and therefore act rather than react I think that, and this is not going to be a bunch of money immediately in the next 2 years, but I would submit that in a 10, 15, 20-year period of time, such a unit would be saving money in the billions, at least the track that we've been on for the last 20 years in CDCR. So I believe it's just as it had been a focus changing the name with the reorganization of the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, giving a stronger focus on rehabilitation, which has long-term, not short-term benefits societally and as for the institution. The focus on litigation here would have very long-term and significant impacts. You know, we would just be avoiding litigation that's been oppressively costly. This unit wouldn't have to maybe be around forever, but at least I think some semblance of it should continue. Right now, I don't know if this is an appropriate staffing pattern or not. It just seemed to be a reasonable figure of, I think, around 13 PYs or something to be directed to take a very aggressive position in litigation prevention.
I'm just laughing because we haven't had any discussion, and it seems like everybody is on board, Mr. Nielsen. I think this is an eminently reasonable proposal, and even though we don't score savings, at least according to the information I have in the May revise, it's something that seems to me, at least, it would be reasonable that we would anticipate future, not only future savings, but also better practices.
I can give you a very specific example, Madam Chair. Historically, and under the 1972 Morrissey decision, U.S. Supreme Court, attorneys are not required in parole revocation hearings, with rare exceptions, complex cases, et cetera, as that. And as a part of a lawsuit settlement, and that lawsuit was about only one thing, timeliness of hearings, it became everything and all things, including having everybody get an attorney to the cost of some $27 million a year. That in it. Now, we would still require some attorneys, and I expect the savings right now would be maybe 21 million, not 27, because we'd still have some attorneys. But it would have a substantial cost right there that we, and in fact, there's a provision in Marcy's law that would get rid of that attorney requirement to save us that amount of money. So there's some significant dollars here.
And we have a motion to approve, and Mr. Blumenfield has a question or a comment.
Yeah, it's more of a comment. I appreciate you bringing this forward, and I mean, I'm a big believer in an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I'd like to see this philosophy of prevention more on the poverty side of things as well. I think there's a lot of, as we go to the Health and Human Services things, that there are preventive measures that we could be taking, but we're not taking because of our financial situation, and that always is disappointing. But here's a good example on this side where you've identified an area where we can do some prevention, and I applaud you for that.
I agree. Mr. Lowenthal.
I need to, just to understand this, if we're really talking about prevention, wouldn't reform of the existing system do far more than hiring some people to deal with the class action litigation? Isn't much of that litigation due to the fact of overcrowded conditions, of the overwhelming or the potential that people feel for mistreatment in the system, that for the lack of rehabilitation that goes on? Wouldn't we do a lot better to put the money into that to do real prevention than to keep the system in place and then to move people to figure out how to reduce litigation? It just seems to me that we have a pretty good idea, not all the litigation, but of what really are some of the problems that need to be fixed, and those are the issues that really need to be dealt with.
Well, those problems that festered have resulted in the formation of classes and, in fact, the class action lawsuits, and that's what this is, in fact, all about. Identifying those, I said that would be statutory. I should have included budgetary resources, regulatory changes, statutory changes. It's a $10 billion organization, and it's a very unmanageable one. This would help us identify some of those preventive things that would help the entirety of an institution. What I said is a lack of a formation of a class, because you've addressed any potential class concerns.
Well, I agree with you. I still think the real cure and the real prevention is to really reform the system itself, and for us to be looking at that.
Yeah, I agree, but I think...
That's a multi-year challenge, Senator.
I know,
and
I know.
will join
I'm not
you
saying
on it.
this is not a step, but I'm saying if we're really talking about dealing with this, that's really what...
Sounds like we have the beginning of a bipartisan legislative commission and a bicameral legislative commission to start that reform process.
Madam Chair?
Yes. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, Department of Finance. Thank you.
We very much agree with the goal. We think that this is a wise investment and a good thing to do. We in fact had a proposal last year that aimed to do the same thing in terms of get involved at the front end to avoid the costly effects of having class actions and not preventing the litigation on the front end. We think this is a function that is better suited for the Department of Justice, and we think that this idea of creating a litigation prevention unit, and we had a proposal last year, also had a proposal in January, to create such a unit at the Department of Justice, clearly working closely with the Department of Corrections, but having it at an independent entity and have it coordinated out of DOJ.
My concern with that, though, is that those resources could be redirected to other purposes of the Department of Justice, which does not singularly focus on prison litigation, and that has not always been a high priority of the Department of Justice, I can assure you, which has also in part contributed to these lawsuits. So I wouldn't trust them. I generally don't trust corrections, okay? But in this case, I trust them more than justice.
Okay, members, we have a motion on this item. Senate side for in favor. Assembly side for in favor, and one absent who can add on. And Mr. Nielsen, thank you very much for bringing this forward. Really appreciate it. And more positive suggestions we have like that, the happier we all are. Page 8, change sentencing options for lower level offenders for savings of $99.8 million. This is the proposal to change to address wobblers that could currently be felonies or misdemeanors and to address them as misdemeanors. Department of Finance.
Administration proposal to achieve savings. As you've noted, it's 9 specific crimes that we would be proposing to shift from. It's forgery, possession for sale, receiving stolen property, vehicle theft, grand theft, and I'm missing one.
Did you say drug possession for sale, hashish?
Yeah. Oh, hashish offenses and fraud.
Forgery, fraud, yeah.
Members, just at the outset, I would note that staff and I believe everyone is working on a comprehensive package to corrections that they want to bring back to us for one action. So I'm going to recommend this item and others to be held open, but we can certainly discuss them at this point. Did the LAO's office have a response? Or?
Paul Golozewski with the Legislative Analyst's Office. We believe that this is a reasonable proposal. In fact, we suggested it last year as part of the 2008-2009 budget. We do have a scoring disagreement with the administration. They have the proposal commencing January 1st, 2010. We would suggest, if you did enact this proposal, to enact it July 1st, 2009, and you would get double the savings.
And I understand that when the comprehensive package comes back for action, some of these numbers may change.
Madam Chair, I forgot one of the crimes, which is petty theft of the prior.
Oh, that was one of the crimes you forgot to list. Thank you. Mr. Cheney?
You know, we've been rolling these around. When the LAO proposed the wobbler issue last year, the Senate said, we sort of don't like taking discretion away from courts. We think there ought to be wobblers, and what we looked into, which the legislation for which has been rolling around all year and got vetoed twice in between wherever, got vetoed in January right after it became part of the governor's budget, but okay. Was to do sentencing changes and to acknowledge, if you will, inflationary cost increases in crime. That grand theft, as I pointed out at the time last year, was the same now as it was 30 years ago when I was in law school, and that somehow the number might reasonably change over those 30 years. That it was $400 then, it was $400 today. That didn't make a lot of sense to me that was now grand theft threshold. So we worked on a proposal that was part of last year's May conference report to change the threshold for property crimes. We then found through some research and courts and assistance of ambitious law students throughout the state, that there were a lot of property crimes for which that was true: fraud, forgery, petty theft, receiving, all of them. So we have that proposal that's been around all year that was part of the December budget package. And now we're talking about wobblers again. So I have some concerns about things like grand theft. I don't have as much concern about some of the possession type crimes where you'd end up in drug court anyway. I don't know what levels of possession you're talking about, whether receiving is sort of the grand theft threshold is the threshold, it seems to me, for wobbler. But your proposal is that there would just be no wobbler discretion on any of these crimes?
There are numerous other wobblers that we're not affecting. Our proposal for, as it relates to these particular 9 specific crimes, would be that they would no longer be wobblers. Other related things could be charged as a felony, depending on
so
how
a vehicle, even though it might be worth $20,000, is not a wobbler? Vehicle theft?
Vehicle theft would no longer be a wobbler. Yes, we would be proposing to change that, and people would be serving time locally if convicted of this crime.
It's a little tricky. I don't know how to think about it. I also would hope that as folks are talking about this, they think about it in combination with the change in threshold of property crimes that were from last year.
And we supported those changes as well. That bill,
except for the part where you vetoed it.
That bill was unfortunately double joined to revenue increases that the governor did not support. Hence the reason why that bill got vetoed.
Mr. Nielsen, and then Mr. Dutton.
Belabor this, but I would just observe that whenever the legislature takes action on parole policies or sentencing, it better do so with the 20 years, 25 years in mind. What will the impact to society be, and what will be the impact to potential victims? And this could have very serious and lasting consequences. I have some great reservations about it. I just would say we need to be mindful of the long-term consequences of such changes.
Mr. Dutton. Oh, I'm sorry.
And we would be proposing this as a short-term change. We're not proposing it as a permanent change.
Mr. Dutton.
Short-term change? What did you just say? So we're going to go back? We'll give them a free pass for now and then... That wasn't my question, but I mean...
we would be proposing a sunset to these changes, and we'd reevaluate in a couple of years. But our proposal includes a sunset.
So we're gonna do this as a pilot program to see if we get an increase in identity theft and all these other things. That's what we're doing. I think a lot of us have done actually identity theft forums and things down in our district, and especially with senior citizens. I mean, that's something I'm not so sure that I just happen to be one of those who believe that a certain amount of these things becomes deterrence, and so I'm really got some serious concerns that you're even going to see this kind of a savings, and I hate to keep bringing this up, but I think it's another one of those bright moral red lines that we better really seriously think about, because I know some of the stuff that's on this list I'm looking at. I mean, the grand theft fine, you're talking about adjusting it for cost of living and whatever, but you're talking about identity theft is one of the things you're talking about, I guess, and you know, the chop shops and stuff like that. I've really got some real problems. And now you've also got the possession of controlled substances, meth and so forth, which is a big problem. We're taking away money from narcotics enforcement and things like that, and yet we're going to reduce the penalty for actually possession of control or sale and possession. I just think that's a real big problem. So I can't support it.
It's highly problematic. However, probably necessary. The recommendation is to hold this open pending action on a comprehensive package. Page 9 is the same recommendation. This is targeted commutation and deportation of undocumented inmates for savings of $182 million. LAO, would you like to open on this, please? Excuse me, Department of Finance. I'm looking at you, Anna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we talked a little bit about this one previously, but generally the state is paying for about $1 billion in costs associated with incarcerating people who are here illegally, and we believe that given the fact that the federal government is giving us roughly 10 cents on the dollar for these costs, that it's important that we look at shifting these inmates into federal custody. The process here would be going through the commutation process. The governor would be reviewing individual applications for commutation. We would first start with nonviolent, one offense, non-serious, non-sex offenders. It would be an individual by individual determination. We would be working with ICE to shift these individuals into federal custody, and they'd be subject to deportation. The savings is basically consistent with our overall target, and that's essentially the proposal. We've already begun the conversations with the federal government and are working on making sure that it would be a seamless transition from state custody to federal custody and deportation.
Have you had any conversations with the Chief Justice, though? Because some of these commutations would require 4 members of the state Supreme Court to approve. So those are not within the governor's control.
We would need to work with the courts on an expedited process for those individuals. Our focus and our priority would be to start with the applications for the individuals who have a single offense and who the governor could commute on his own authority without the concurrence of the Supreme Court.
To the extent that it's within the governor's control, this is something, again, that would be painful, but probably necessary. Members' comments? Mr. Nielsen?
Well, I just would observe as one who's had a lot of experience. I have no confidence whatsoever that the federal government is going to have any interest whatsoever in picking these individuals up and formally deporting them. And that means they're going to stay in California, and they won't have any parole tail. They'll just be free to roam in our communities. And further, if they are formally deported, I have no cause to believe if they come back that U.S. attorneys will prosecute them under a reform that I worked on in 1996 in Congress and the immigration reform of that year. So no consequence. And, you know, there's good argument you're setting up a whole other class. If you're foreign-born, you get a break. If you're domestic, you don't. You stay. That's sort of an inequitable thing in itself.
And we are working with the federal government, and we have implemented this policy for purposes of we're discharging from parole, and we're working with the federal government, transitioning people into federal custody, and they are getting deported.
Mr. Cheney and then Mr. Lowenthal.
Well, just a couple points. Number one, this number, talk about numbers that are unrealistic.
Okay, that's it.
This one's right up there, and I mean, I wish I could get $182 million worth of savings, and I hope we find that in prisons in general and through other things, but this one isn't going to do that by any stretch of anybody's imagination. Yes, the federal government, we should send them a bill, you know, for the $900 million. We should all keep pounding on them about SCAP. But on that note, I could find $100 million of this just by virtue of assuming that Congress sticks with. It's my understanding that in the appropriations markup last week, Congress did put in $300 million for SCAP, which is similar to the amount that was in there the last couple of years. It's not as much as it used to be or as it should be, but I think when it's 300 nationally, we get about 100. That's kind of the pattern over the last few years. So we might be able to assume that Congress will follow through, and we should keep encouraging our delegation to not only do that amount and up it. I know Senator Benoit has a resolution on that, and I think we all ought to be encouraging them. In the meantime, to Mr. Nielsen's point, actually, in the real world, they really do take them because they really have to. The only folks that I understand would be in this program are folks for whom there is already an immigration detention hold. So regardless of they would have to be transferred to immigration custody whenever they're released. And I think what the governor's proposing, which I don't object to, partly because the feds have refused to pay, is basically taking folks and releasing them a bit earlier than might otherwise. Not that they won't have served most of their sentence, but more or less the last 6 months or so of a sentence on the less serious folk.
It'd be an individual by individual determination. The first category of people that we'd be looking at would be the non-serious, non-violent, non-sex, who served a portion of their sentence, and they would be released to federal custody.
Directly.
And we would first confirm that the ICE hold is an actual ICE hold, and make sure that they're subject to deportation before the transfer occurred.
Yeah, I mean, so you know, these folks, if they stay 6 more months and we pay another $30,000 for their care and feeding for 6 more months, they still get deported at the end. Let the feds pay for the 6 months if it takes them that long to, if they have to have deportation trials, that's their problem. I mean, I wish we could figure out how to just transfer custody to the federal government, but I mean, in my neighborhood, they won't even prosecute. Different fight. But, I'm okay with this, but I think your scoring is way off. What's the LAO number?
We estimated $50 million in savings. Given the groups that the administration has identified as being eligible for the commutation, we don't see how they could get to 182 million.
Yeah, they'd have to reduce all 20,000 to get there, is my reading of it.
The projection assumed that we were, I think, looking at 8,500, and we'd agree that it'd be better to assume a more conservative number in terms of the scoring. So,
if you'll score my 100 million.
Going once, going twice. Mr. Lowenthal, and then Mr. You're good?
No, I'm pretty good. Yeah, I just think that I was just struck with the numbers were way out of line. This will definitely, if the governor has to commute these, will keep him in his desk in Sacramento. I'll tell you that.
Mr. Blumenfield, then Mr. Dutton.
Just trying to get a handle. How many folks after they're deported come back into the country? Do we have some figures on that? I've heard it's around 50%. But I didn't know if you knew that number or could verify that, because that would be an interesting statistic to know in terms of what the real savings are. And then the others, I was trying to get at how much it costs per person. I was just looking at single conviction non-serious offenders. If it's 1,400 and you had 182, then it's like 130,000 you're saving per person. But you're saying that you're assuming about 8,500 people, so that brings it down a little bit more reasonable. I'm trying to get a sense of how much you think per person that we're saving.
The marginal rate is approximately $25,000 per inmate. So the cut of inmates that you're talking about is 1,400, and we project savings of about 33 million full year once it's fully implemented from that population not being in prison.
Okay. Great.
Mr. Dutton.
To get the savings, that means there must be some changes in some of the fixed costs and other things. Are you anticipating then we're going to have fewer guards and administrative personnel and maybe close a couple of prisons? Is that what the thought process is? Or
Yes, we do anticipate that as the population effects materialize, then CDCR will manage its population and do its best to concentrate people and reduce yards and or prisons and contracts.
But that means that it'll take you time to realize that savings unless we've got a lot of vacancies right now. So I was just going to ask, could you report back to us? Because I've heard that we have like close to 1,000 vacancies at headquarters of positions that are unfilled. And maybe we ought to be considering whether those need to be filled.
Eliminate them if they're at headquarters. But I think you've got more than that on the yards.
I don't know, but I'm right now thinking about headquarters because I'm not so sure that hit.
And we are proposing reductions to headquarters as well as reductions to operations in a variety of different components of CDCR, including at the Department of, I can't remember what DJJ stands for, Juvenile Justice. Department of Juvenile Justice, as part of either proposals that are coming before you next and as well as our parole reform package.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, again, this is another item that will be held open. It sounds like there is some, well, because we're going to have a more comprehensive corrections cuts package. But I think there's a...
I'd move this one. This one's independent to me of the other, but I don't know.
Well, the problem is we don't know the number, and that's what I was about to say. I think there's a consensus on the committee to take the action, but we don't have the actual number to score yet. So we can move on to page 10 then. Prison and parole reforms. For an increased cost of $90.1 million. Department of Finance, sorry.
The governor had made a veto reduction to the Budget Act when enacted of $400 million associated with wanting to work with you on a package of parole reforms. And it goes a little bit beyond parole reforms, but we're looking at first... We're looking at focusing parole resources on the highest risk offenders. Basically, we'll be doing a risk assessment to determine which parolees we'd continue to focus our parole services on. We'd look at some increases, some enhanced 40-to-1 instead of the current ratios for level of supervision for the people who would remain, who we continue to supervise on parole. And we're looking at, in addition to some of the changes in parole, which, as I mentioned, is a combination of less supervision for the less risky, for the low and moderate risk, more supervision for the high-risk offenders. We'd also be looking at some changes, updating of the property crime thresholds. They were last updated in 1982. And we would also be making some changes on the credit side of the equation, some establishing additional completion credits, and as well as some jail day-for-day credits. And lastly, we're making some proposing some reductions to headquarters and reductions to operations for a total level of savings of approximately $300 million. And there's reductions and increases that achieve that net reduction.
Elio, did you have a comment?
As the Department of Finance just mentioned, there's a lot of components to the proposal. The $90 million augmentation that they're requesting, however, is related primarily to increased supervision for parolees, as well as to increase their fugitive apprehension efforts. These aren't really implementation costs. They're to increase supervision for the people remaining on parole. And so given the state's fiscal condition, we would recommend that you reject this proposal.
Okay. Mr. Nielsen, did you have a
Well, I just observed that's another way of CDCR simply getting more money in their budget without fixing anything. And there's some other suggestions that I sat down with a high official a while back, and the $400 million that was to be removed was removed. I suggested that at best they'd save $175 million with all the reforms that were suggested at that time, some of which are included here. And it was observed to me that actually the number crunchers had come up with $1.5 to $200 million. So I was with nothing to go on but my gut instincts for many, many years was just about where the number crunchers came. My point is it's going to be a little bit unrealistic, I think, to realize some of the savings that are purported. And this 90,000 or 90 million, I think that we've got to be very careful about what we're just giving more resources down a situation that's kind of broken. The increasing caseloads is indeed one of the options. It's called bank supervision, low to no supervision. Don't discharge the individuals and then take the silliness that you can impose a parole warrantless search tail on someone who has already discharged their duties to society, both being discharged from parole and having completed their sentence. That's not realistic. But keeping someone on a certain class of inmates, and that could be parolees, a very large number, on low to no supervision would be okay. And with that, you maintain warrantless search, you maintain revocation as a discipline, as a consequence for failure, and very importantly, you retain parolee resources to that individual if they get into some difficulty. So that is a better proposal than the discharge and thinking you can hold on to warrantless search and then that they get prosecuted if they get caught. There are some other suggestions, I think. That's my point.
And I realize the department has some comments. I'd like to get the questions from the members out first.
Well,
Mr. Lynn.
I'll wait.
Okay.
To hear the comment.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that the $90 million that we're talking about here has a few different components. One of them is extremely important to getting the savings in right away, because there are implementation costs, about $10 million for case record staff and other people that will need to hit the ground immediately as soon as this becomes effective and start going through case files to determine eligibility for enhanced credit earning, and to, before people go on parole, to check their record to see whether they're eligible for the no parole option. So of that 90 million, 10 million we think is vital to get all the savings that we've scored. The remainder we think is also important, though, because we're increasing parole supervision for the parolees who will be left after this proposal, which are going to be the more serious and high-risk parolees.
Madam Chair, we disagree with the Department of Finance statement just now. Basically what happened was the department identified $415 million in savings, which is $15 million more than the $400 they were required to come up with. So the $10 million that they are referring to could come out of that extra $15 million. Therefore, this $90 million that they're asking for really is tied to the increased parole supervision costs that I was mentioning that are not implementation costs that we think that you should reject.
Madam Chair, I'm ready.
Mr. Leno.
I'm ready to comment.
Tried to go to you first, but
No,
that's
thank
okay.
you. It's a little embarrassing, I have to say. We held a hearing, a joint legislative hearing with Assembly, Policy, and Budget chairs of corrections and the counterparts in the Senate. The governor had blue-penciled $400 million. The charge given to corrections was to come forward with your unallocated $400 million. They came to the committee with only $300 million. They didn't even bring forward $400 million. It was about $310. This is really just acknowledging that you couldn't do your job, and now you need to put it back because this was done in February for 0809. So now we got to put it back because you didn't get to 400. So I think there's a lot of song and dance, with all due respect, that why you need the money. You didn't get to the 400 million. And I know we're going to put this over, so I agree with LAO completely. We're going to put this over because we're going to come forward with a comprehensive package. But let's just acknowledge what it is. You couldn't get to 400 million.
The 400 million was a target. We worked on what we thought made the most sense from a public safety standpoint. We think that we need additional resources in order to make sure that we're implementing science-based supervision, and we need additional resources in order to be able to have that supervision of the high-risk offenders. We agree that we don't achieve the full 400 million. 400 million was a target. We are proposing reductions far in excess of that $400 million amount that was set as a target in the February budget.
And I want to acknowledge that you have, and we're going to be discussing how we best can get to that $1 billion plus figure. But put it in perspective, when we're slashing 20, 30, 40, 50% from other state governmental operations, and the charge out of February's vote was come forward with 400 million out of a close to 10 bit, well, it's 7.2. We're talking about a few percent out of a total budget of, let's say, 10 billion. We're talking the charge was fined 4%, and they came with 3%. So we've got a lot further digging to do in corrections.
Ms. Ducheney and then Mr. Nielsen.
Well, this is really frustrating because last year, about this time, actually in May, I suppose, but in conference, in June last year, we proposed a package of parole reforms designed to save at the time, and it did include increasing the caseload because it had a earned discharge, similar to your banked idea, but a little bit different. But I'm okay with the summary. I call that summary parole. It's like summary probation. But we had part of that. We had credit reforms. We had sentencing reforms. We had all of that in a package. We presented it a year ago. It saved, I think everybody at the time thought $400 or $500 million could have been implemented in the current year, not just the budget year, would have been fully engaged by now. And it included increasing the parole caseload for the serious offenders. We went to 50 to 1. I'm okay with 45 to 1. I do think, we're moving one group over. If we do something like a bank caseload, to move them over and say you're not going to get as much supervision. The folks that are remaining with supervision are the more serious folks, and I think it is appropriate to lower the parole caseload for those folks. So, but that was part of last year's proposal, and I'm just a little frustrated that I'm sitting here a year later and I lost the first 400 million, 500 million in savings, and now I'm losing another 90, and I don't know how to think about that. We need to figure out how to get these programs going, because over the long year, in the out years, it's once you get them started, the first year is going to be the least number of savings. Over the long run, as you get some of these in place, if we can manage to continue to fund foster care and child welfare workers and CalWORKs so that we don't create more criminals, we could start to get this under control. But there's got to be some balance to that. What is it, the number? The last one I remember was 70% of all the folks in prison are former foster children.
It's a very large percentage. Mr. Nielsen?
Well, I would concur with the senator that that's where to start. The way we dry up the pipeline or lessen the pipeline is to work with our children, foster children very particularly. I'm very dedicated to that. I do have to make an acknowledgement here, though, and it's to the issue of requesting that we're going to lower the supervision and we're going to hire all these new people. Words are rather hollow when you look at the history of action within this agency. And just in this last year, I still have a memorandum. several months ago. I hope it's now been discontinued, but this is in Region 3 of paroles. That's in Los Angeles County. And because the memo goes to note that we don't have enough parole agents, and they don't have enough parole agents because those are PYs they didn't fill for salary savings. I'll bet you anything in the world. So they don't fill the position. Now they don't have enough parole agents. And therefore, they are going to increase the caseloads for serious and violent controlling case offenders up to 500 to 1. The gentleman who murdered 4 officers in Oakland was on around 71 caseload. You're putting serious and violent on 500 to 1 in Region 3 as, quote, pilot program because you didn't fill the positions that you were budgeted for. That's typical of this organization and why you have to be very skeptical. If we say we're going to give them more agents to lower caseloads, we need to have hat-in-hand proof that that's going to happen. And since 1974, this organization has been fighting me tooth and nail over something called the Robin Reagan regulation, which we put into effect in 1994. It simply says if you're a serious and violent controlling case, anything you do on parole has to be reported to the Board of Prison Terms. That is a regulation that has been illegally violated for many, many years. But that's a clear indication that you really are going to take care of the serious and violent ones. It doesn't mean the board will put everyone back in prison, but they will at least examine the behavior. And 2 other conditions in the regulation indicate if you have repetitious and escalating behavior, then that's held to a higher standard of account. In any event, if we're going to do anything like this, we really need to make sure that there's specificity of what these agents are going to be doing, not that they're just built into the budget and the money's used elsewhere.
Okay, this is another one of the items that will come back to us.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. Keith Geminder with Finance. Just wanted to address one other point that the LAO had mentioned, that the idea that there are additional savings identified for this proposal that we could fund the implementation out of. However, the $90 million figure is a net number that includes both the $16 million in increased savings that we now estimate and offset by $106 million in additional costs. So the $90 million is a net number that already includes the savings. We really think it's important to have staff to implement this, or else we'll be to the end of 9/10 and not achieve anywhere close to what we're estimating for sentence credits and no parole.
Thank you for that clarification. Understanding again that this is going to come back as a package. Members, I had hoped to wrap things up today at 6. I do want to go to the vote-only calendar on this part of our agenda because I want to hold open the entire first page. These are items such as judicial staffing, judges' compensation savings, and reappropriations for new courthouses. These are items that I think need to be held open for the time being without your objection. And if that's okay, the entire first page. So they're all judicial branch items. It's on page 20. I'm sorry. We're looking at pages 20, 21, and 22. That's the vote-only calendar. And what I'm proposing, with your permission, members, is to hold the entire list on page 20 open. It relates to the judicial branch, and I'd like to hold those open for the time being. So the vote-only items would be those on pages 21 and 22. And if that's okay with members, then I would ask if there are any other items that need to be brought out separately for discussion or separately for vote.
So, Madam Chair, the vote is only on pages 21 and 22.
Correct.
Items 15 through 39.
Correct.
Would like to pull out, not for discussion, but I think we're willing to concur on everything there except for item number 29, with which we're opposed.
29, Assembly. 29 is Seismic Safety Commission support?
Beg your pardon?
29 is the Seismic Safety Commission support?
Correct.
Okay. So the Assembly is 3-2 on that vote.
You don't like the commission?
Denise, it's fees that are...
Can you turn on your microphone?
Turn on. I just didn't know what it was. It's trailer bill language, and I didn't know what language it was.
Oh, okay. There are fees imposed for things not on insurance policies for things not directly related to the insurance policies. Related to earthquakes, yes, but not directly to insurance policies.
Seismic studies instead of action retrofitting or surveying, but it's studies.
It's a shaky nexus.
Is that
No
existing
pun
law?
intended.
I understood it to be something that did not change existing law. Is that true or not? Are we just extending it? Is this finance trailer bill?
One moment.
Nona Martinez, Department of Finance. This is trailer bill that extends the sunset on an already existing program. It would continue the program through seismic safety.
On the Senate side, that's a 3 aye and 1 no. So, and 3-2 on the Assembly side. Any other items on the vote on them? Okay. Then we need a motion to approve the remainder of the vote-only calendar. So the motion is to approve the vote-only calendar from items 15 through 28 and 30 through 39. On the Assembly side, a 4-0 vote, and on the Senate side, a 4-0 vote, and the Assembly side, a 5-0 vote. All right. So, members, I would like to conclude today's session there. We still have a substantial portion of the public safety agenda to go through. And what I would suggest, since we've briefed on local government, I would like to start tomorrow at 9 a.m. That's all right. We have session on the Assembly side, I know. Does anybody on the Senate side? 9 o'clock Senate session as well.
So you want to convene here at coincident with the convening of the Assembly?
That was my suggestion. We can meet at 9:15, 9:30. I'm just trying to find more time in the day.
Right.
Because
at least give us time to go on the floor and flip the key and.
Sure. 9:30.
9:30 is better for us. We
All
might
right.
be done by then.
All right. Then let's meet back at 9:30. I do want to try to get through the remaining agenda items by sometime tomorrow.
Well, tomorrow we don't have committees.
Right. No, I'm just telling everybody what the workload is intended to be for tomorrow. All right. Tomorrow is Thursday. If we can get through the first pass of the entire agenda tomorrow, we can come back on Friday. That'll be on call of the chair, but yeah. Okay, let me adjourn the meeting. We can have this conversation. The meeting's adjourned, and I need to clear the room for reconciliation.